Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first day of eGroup's Microsoft Virtual Roadshow, Enable a Secure and Productive Workforce. My name is Jason Webster. I'll be your host for the 2 days, kind of coordinating the events, and we're just going to give it a few more seconds before we get going here, and we'll get started. All right, looks like we have a good amount of attendees in the room, so let's go ahead and get started because I know we've got a lot of things to cover today with Jesus and myself. So, by way of introduction again, my name's Jason Webster. I'm the principal for the Mid-Atlantic for eGroup and come from a deep Microsoft background in working with Microsoft technologies and clients across the US and even internationally and helping them have success in their modern workplace environments, as well as Azure, for those that'll be joining tomorrow to talk a little bit more about Azure. Joining with me, we have Jesus Shelby. Jesus is our director of cloud service and comes from an extensive background in working with Microsoft technologies in both on-premises as well as in both clouds, and we'll be covering some of the presentations today. Looking forward to it. Before we get started, though, I want to hit a couple housekeeping items. Questions for those of you. I think everybody's pretty much joined a Teams live event over the last year for sure. But just to be thorough, for those of you that have not, there is a question and answer feature within the tool. So please post your questions. We will review those. Your questions don't go live to the audience unless we actually publish them. So what we'll do is if you have a question that's a one-on-one related question, please feel free to ask it, and we'll have people, extra presenters, extra eGroup people on the sidelines reviewing those questions and answering those for you directly. But at the same time, if the question is something that is beneficial for the full audience, while Jesus is presenting or while I'm presenting, one of us will interrupt the other one and we can ask those live as well. So let's please keep this as interactive as possible. This is the fourth year running we've been doing these events, and traditionally we've done these all along the East Coast and in various states, particularly in Microsoft MTCs and various settings where we could be really interactive in person, and we're really looking forward to getting back to that in the fall. But for now, please ask those questions. Let's keep it interactive. No topic is off limits, so send them on in. If you have any trouble using the Q&A feature, just please reach out to me. Send me an email. Get a hold of us, and we'll help you with that as well. We'll also be taking breaks. So we'll kind of play this by feel as we go through it. We've got 3 presentations today, so we'll be taking 5 to 10 minute breaks based on timing and based on the questions we have and things like that. But we'll take breaks between sessions. But at the same time, it's a virtual live event, so adult rules do apply. So take breaks as needed, and we'll see you when you get back. And lastly, at the end, we have some prizes. So what we're going to be doing is we'll be selecting after the event. We'll be taking the attendee list. We'll be randomly selecting a winner to be able to choose between an away carry-on case. All looking forward to getting back to travel here in the next year or so. Some Ray-Ban gift card. So the Ray-Bans, obviously, just in time for summer, or for those of you that would rather a $150 donation of your choice to a charity of your choice. So some good prizes to get there. So let's start off talking about what do we want to accomplish today, and what we're hoping to communicate with you all is discuss how Microsoft 365 delivers an extraordinary end user experience with secure, productive tools that are designed to seamlessly work together. And we'll get into kind of all the different words in that sentence, but things like secure and productive. What does it mean for tools? What does it mean to seamlessly work together with first-party integrations? And how can that not only deliver an extraordinary end user experience, but also for those in the IT side of the house, simplify your management and give you time back in the day so that you can spend more of your time providing value to the business as opposed to maintaining and supporting the technology of the business. So how are we going to get there? This welcome introduction, we're going to go through that a little bit. Then Jesus is going to step up and talk about enabling team collaboration. quickly followed by security in the cloud. So Jesus is going to take us pretty much home for the most part of the day, and then I'll jump back up and talk about successful remote work. Particularly the way I like to do this is to share stories of other clients, and not only what they've done with remote work pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, but also things that are happening as organizations are looking at return to the office, depending on what part of the country and kind of what line of business you're in. So I'll share some stories around that, as well as specifically what they did to be successful in all three phases of kind of remote work. We'll do some wrap up and giveaways, and then we'll break. So let's dive right in. So when we talk about what does it take to build a cloud adoption roadmap or enable successful remote work or be productive in the cloud, really our goal is to share a common approach we've used at eGroup alongside Microsoft over the last 4 to 5 years, in which we like to say we meet you where you're at. Every organization is on a different part of their journey to the public cloud, whether it be Microsoft 365 or Azure, like we're going to talk about tomorrow. Some of it adopted, basic email services. Some haven't adopted email services. Some are looking at file share migration. Some are looking at, how do I secure remote workforces with mobile device management, advanced compliance capabilities, those types of things. There's a lot of different things that we can do along the way, but our goal really is to work with you all to meet you where you're at in that journey, so that we can help you plan, design, implement, and maintain that extraordinary end user experience every step of along the way, from starting off with securing identity, ensuring that your cloud is a secure place to work, talking about like what does efficient collaboration mean for your organization, not just let's deploy Teams or let's deploy OneDrive. Let's talk about like what do your end users really need to succeed, and how can we deliver that to them in the most effective manner, so that they can then in turn deliver for your clients. How do we secure them wherever they are, whether they're in the office, whether they're at home, whether they're traveling, mobile, on a laptop, company-owned device, all of those good things. How do we manage those devices when we get to, once the device is secure, how do we manage it? How do we make sure they're always on the latest applications, whether it's a Microsoft application, Office 365, or it's a line of business application that needs some care and feeding along the way to make sure it's always on the latest and greatest version and everybody's on the same page. How do we communicate? Things like Teams live events, Teams meetings, phone calls, voice services. How do we integrate that into the end user experience so that when you make a call to Jason Webster, it dials his laptop. I have mobile apps, so it dials my phone. If I'm in my car, Apple CarPlay rings. How do we create those connected experiences so that people can be accessible and engage where they need to be, when they need to be, as well as not when they're off the clock, so to speak. But then kind of beyond just collaboration, how do we take the inefficiencies out of work for our end users and talk about things like business process automation, so that we can take complex, manual, time-intensive workflows, automate those for consistency, connect different experiences within the Microsoft ecosystem, but within third-party ecosystems as well, so that we can drive efficiency in internal processes. And then ultimately, organizations more and more today are faced with advanced compliance, GDPR, CJIS if you're in the government space and criminal justice, PII, PCI, HIPAA, all kinds of different high trust regulations. How do we mold your cloud to meet those security scenarios, be able to help streamline your audit processes, give you the reporting intelligence and confidence that you can, call your environment secure, know it's secure, and then prove it's secure without an extensive amount of work. So wherever you're at in that journey, our goal is to understand that position and then help you chart the course to where you want to be. And our team of experts, both technical experts as well as business experts, former CIOs, CTOs, the directors of IT that have done these and been successful in the past, have that capability, that experience, and that visibility where we've been able to do this hundreds of times across many different clients to help talk about what will be successful, as well as just as importantly, sometimes things that we've seen that haven't been successful in the past so that you can help avoid some of those pitfalls. So lastly, before I turn it over to Jesus, I want to tell you a little bit about who is eGroup. eGroup, we were founded in 1999, so been a little bit more than 2 decades of delivering successful outcomes for our clients. We like to say our clients are our chief investors. Customer satisfaction is at the core of everything we do. Very proud to say that we have delivered 97.5% plus, sometimes 100% satisfaction on average over the last 3 years. We measure that in every interaction we do, from a project to down to the reactive support request with our managed services organization. Customer satisfaction is at the core of everything we do, and we couldn't do what we've been doing for the last 2+ decades without our clients and helping them drive success. From a Microsoft perspective, we are a managed national partner, which is the top tier of partnership that you can have with Microsoft. So I always kind of candidly and jokingly say that that gives us access to all the programs that Microsoft has available to be able to help you all succeed. So things like understanding licensing, making sure that you have the right people available, both from an eGroup perspective as well as from a Microsoft team perspective, and funding, for those POCs and pilots and production rollouts when you have acquired the technology to be able to assist in the rollout. We also have deep experience in the modern workplace space with Microsoft. So everything from kind of, the initial landing spots, we see a lot of organizations with Exchange and OneDrive, to advanced security, not only in the cloud, but how do we secure that back into your data center, your offices, and then your remote offices, nationwide and worldwide. Teams, how do we collaborate? How do we extend teams? How do we create third-party interactions with teams so that we can make the Teams platform work perfectly for you in your use case, as well as adding in those voice and calling capabilities. Automation, being able to help you automate those business processes again. SharePoint, something that's very near and dear to me. I mean, I've personally worked with SharePoint going back to before it was called SharePoint. So doing everything from upgrading to, figuring out if you're still on SharePoint 2007, how do we get you all the way to SharePoint Online? How do we build those interactions that users love? How do we make sure that SharePoint doesn't go off the rails? We've done a lot of that over the years and have seen great success in helping organizations deploy SharePoint Online. The voice and calling features I was discussing, as well as device management, which has been extremely popular these days, particularly as we tackle flexible work scenarios and needing to ensure that we secure not only Windows 10, but devices, Apple devices, Android devices, and every device in the ecosystem, regardless of where it's at, and determine where people should have access. And then broadly, beyond the Microsoft ecosystem, kind of the first 2 bullets there, we like to say we deliver speed and certainty in the cloud and data center. So we work a lot with modern data center architecture solutions with partners like Nutanix, networks and security. So when we're talking about things like Azure or Office 365, and we're talking about file systems like, from our Cisco partnerships, as well as other firewall and network vendors we work with, how do we secure connectivity to your cloud, but also within your offices and in your data center? Data protection solutions, both protecting Office 365 data, the topic of the day, to Azure, back to on-premises, to third-party clouds, but also within your data center, your servers, your clients, your laptops. Disaster recovery, ensuring those business operations through replication and multiple routes to success, for both infrastructure as well as cloud, stays online and meets the SLAs that your business demands. And then virtual desktop and end user computing, some of those things of how do we provide access to these tools to the end users to meet your use cases, whether that's through VDI scenarios or, as we were talking about previously, mobile device management. And then lastly, but not last, we provide managed services. So both professional services to help you get the job done, but for organizations that are looking for ongoing care and feeding of these systems, upgrades, patching, someone keeping a watchful eye on them over time to ensure that you're meeting the SLAs for your business. We have a robust and flexible suite of managed services to address all of the needs above. With that, I will transfer it over to Jesus, and we'll dive right into our first presentation, which is enabling team collaboration. Jesus, want to do a quick introduction and then take it away?
Yes, sir. Let me get all straightened out here. All right, excellent. So real quick, this section is we're going to go ahead and jump in and go into the collaboration portion of the discussion. So here we'll have a quick intro. That's, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. We'll go into the Microsoft collaboration tools that are, available. I'll highlight a little bit about, the scenarios and where they're used and how they can really be deployed to give your end users more power in their own job and what they do. And we'll make some time for some Q&A. As Jason noted, Q&A throughout the event. Please go ahead and ping him in there. He'll answer questions behind the scenes. If there's anything he feels he needs to interrupt me in that we need to address, he'll pop in. We'll answer it there. But at the end as well, we might just pick a few and grab some out of the box and then answer those here on the call. And then we'll have the quick outro for this section. Give us time for a break before we get into the security portion and kind of the mobile management portion. So I'm Jesus. I have been with eGroup over 8 years. I'm currently the director of the cloud services, and prior to that role, I was actually the solution architect here on staff. And I have a pretty varied background when it comes to technology and pretty strong in Microsoft overall, both from the server products that Jason mentioned before, as well as all the cloud products, Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Azure. And prior to joining eGroup, I worked with some pretty large organizations, as you can see here, Honeywell, General Dynamics. I led the team that was responsible for all the web assets for the United States Navy web assets for the medical field there. So I've been doing this for a while, and I'm still excited all about it. I get in, I can talk about these tools. It's why Jason had me in here and what they can do. It's probably the most value you can get out of the software products today, some of these Microsoft SKUs that are out there versus what we used to have to piece together, putting prem on our data centers from before. So jumping in here, collaboration. I grabbed this quote from AIM, and I thought it worked well here, right? It's not just about working together, but it's working together for a common purpose, right? A shared goal that actually has some benefit at the end, right? It's not just getting together to work on something with actually no output. It's working with coworkers, working with, clients and external vendors, and producing something at the end of it. And this is where the Microsoft 365 tools can really come in and shine. As you'll see here, I pooled essentially a lot of the tools that are available in your Microsoft 365 SKUs. Now, these on here, right here from the collaboration perspective, they're generally available on just about every SKU family. So that is, if you're familiar how Microsoft does their licensing, they're going to have like their Microsoft 365 and E3 package, which has a lot of different services in there, or an E5 package. There's also business level branded packages that are really targeted organizations that are under like 300 people, like headcount wise, that also have these available in there. So they make it available to a broad range of organizations for their needs. And those SKUs start to differentiate a bit based in the higher level capabilities, more around security, which we'll talk about in the next section. So today we're going to highlight on talk about a few of these core areas that Jason alluded to in the intro. So Microsoft Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, and the Power Apps platforms, and what those can do for you and what they bring to the table, right? So again, the big three here: Microsoft Teams, SharePoint Online, which if you've been around and you've heard SharePoint, a lot of times that has like a love-hate relationship. Yep.
Hey, real quick, I don't think you're sharing your screen. I think we're still on the next up slide from my side.
Okay, where's my Teams here?
Yeah, it's showing that my desktop is the one that is live.
Yeah, I just reshared it again.
Looks like it's working now.
Oh well, let's go back just a bit. Man, I had like my picture and everything, so you let me pass that up. All right, so this was the quote that I was talking about before, but when I was talking about collaboration, so move on to that. But I'll back up a bit. So this slide here shows all of the collaboration tools that I was just speaking to that are kind of in those packages. So you can see there's a lot in here, and they provide different functions. Sometimes they overlap, but it's really about finding the right tool that works for you in here. But it gives us a lot of flexibility in how we work. So these are the subset of the items we're going to get into today, and then that brings me to where we were. As far as the sharing there. So Microsoft Teams is the big piece that brings everything together, and we're going to spend a big section on that. SharePoint Online has been the traditional collaboration tool, right? So before Teams existed, SharePoint was around. We deployed it on premises there. And if you had experience with SharePoint before, where I was going there is there's kind of this love-hate relationship sometimes with it, where if you worked in an organization where it was managed well and deployed well and worked, you found a lot of value in it. But if you worked somewhere where maybe that wasn't the case, it might have made your work more difficult and you might have a negative perception there. But I do want to tell you now with the product online and the changes that they've made through the iterations of the lifecycle, everything is so much easier to use. And in fact, SharePoint as a brand doesn't really stand out as much because it's behind the scenes between so many different tools that are out here that you can roll it out even in an organization that say had a negative perception where it might be hard to lead with something called SharePoint. You can kind of just throw that behind the scenes, not say anything about it being SharePoint, and you can start integrating into the different services and offerings that you want to lead out with your organization. And then OneDrive for Business, that's the personal side of SharePoint for users, and replacing home drives and things like that. And we'll get into that. So Microsoft Teams, we're going to start with the big one first. So this guy here, as you can see, this slide points out everything that kind of Microsoft Teams gets into. And there's actually more behind the scenes, but these are just the big ones to call out. It's Teams is kind of the front end, the interface that can actually reach out and talk to SharePoint for sharing, web pages and files. It has an interface for your OneDrive files, so you don't have to drop back out to your personal files. You're going to use your Azure Active Directory for controlling your access. Their chats and things like that end up getting stored and archived out into Exchange. Your meetings are integrated with Exchange, and you can share, OneNote and other things across Teams and notes there. So, if you've used Zoom and WebEx and other products like that, Teams is much more than just one thing, right? It's not just instant messaging. It's not just meetings and messaging. It's a hub really for workspaces. So I know this screen, there's a lot going on, but I actually added it in here just so those of you, whether you're familiar with Teams or not, you can see how many different things are happening in here. And it's not to scare anybody either. When you roll out Teams, you don't necessarily have to roll it out with all of these functions and features enabled and not understanding what to do. You can roll out, start simple, start with maybe instant messaging, start with your meetings, then enable things like voice or start creating collaboration hubs and building your automation into your services. So you can slowly build up on your deployments. You don't have to turn everything on at once. You don't have to know everything at once. And in fact, with a lot of these cloud services, that's almost impossible to do because they continue to iterate and improve on it, especially with Microsoft Teams. If any of you have joined me for our bi-weekly event with the Teams Tuesdays, you know that I go over kind of the new releases that happen, and there's almost always new releases when I cover it between the 2-week periods. So they're continuously adding things onto the platform. So with Teams, you can do a lot of different things, right? So we connect our workforce in here, as you can see there, the chat, instantly reach out to people, within reason. You don't want to have them interrupting there and disrupting work, but you're available wherever you are. A quick button away, you can do a quick video chat. I mean, this last year, of course, I know we've talked about we've branded Zoom fatigue from the meetings, but video still is a good way, to create a connection with the party that's on the other side when you can't be in the same room. You still want to be able to talk to people, see their eyes, and this lets you do that, almost instantly. And when you have multiple people, of course, everybody can show up, and there's different views that Microsoft's built into that too to kind of help with that, like little auditorium views, office views to help with that experience as much as you can without being, in the room. There's limited, capabilities in that, but we've certainly made advances over the last year to make that a better experience. File sharing, is a big one too, is taking things out of email. I mean, how many times we get things whipped up on email, it goes out, comes back, mixed up versions. We have like multiple masters and we have to reconcile it. This really takes that down where you can bring it all in, work on the same document, have a conversation on the side. If there's a question, the back and forth gets too much, just jump on the call and work those out. For those in like manufacturing team floors, you have teams out in the field. They've added this new walkie-talkie feature in there too to connect you in there. So there's an app that you add, and it basically enables teams with the push-to-talk function, right? So you throw that on your mobile phone, and you kind of have a push-to-talk to reach back to other folks in the group. So you can have, a team of 5 people, for instance. You click it, it goes out to all 5 people, and they can respond. A few other apps that I listed here, like Praise. These are just in the interface. You go, you add it. You want to give somebody kudos for something they did, you can drop it in there, and everybody can see it, so they can see those, those positive reinforcements in there. Again, just about that connection there in driving employee engagement. Announcements through Teams, so everybody's working in their little pockets, being able to have something that says, announcements as we go forward. Excuse me there. Had a bit of a cough. So putting that out there, like, all hands events or any message that has to go across there, you can distribute that across Teams. And of course, accessibility features. So that's important anywhere you go, whether it's SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, that everybody can use it. So Microsoft continues to evolve in that front as well. They do go through feedback, they go through testing to make sure it's as accessible as possible that they can do it. So when you have this collaboration hub, as well, beyond bringing the chat and the communication there, you can start looking at how can I leverage this to, digitize or digitalize some of my work processes. So we have things like tasks in Teams. So there's different products that you add in there. So when you want to manage small projects, you're going to go in, you can put it all in a dashboard. You can have your task list, assign it to users, and make that work hub there for that, say, project or activity that you're doing in there. Power Apps, which we're going to get into in a little more detail. You can customize interfaces in there with business logic. The Power Automate is building workflows, right? So you can think like approval processes, or the big one is like PTO requests, and a virtual assistant, which is essentially a bot that you can build now in Teams. And Power BI is dashboards and reporting and visuals that you can basically take data from a variety of data sources and then present that here in Microsoft Teams. And one of the scenarios over here to the right, accelerating onboarding. So think about when you're onboarding somebody, where does all that package go for? You can have pre-recorded videos on how to get them up to speed on your processes, drop those in Teams, easy to click in there. Hosting live events like this, we're using Teams for that. That can go out, the different channels for different areas of that process, sharing policies, processes, putting information in there, having channels for help as people onboarding. So it's a nearly limitless possibilities in terms of scenarios that you can utilize for Microsoft Teams here. And one other thing that we can do beyond that will be voice services. And before I jump into voice, I do want to go ahead and I have it up here. I'm going to show you a quick grab here of a Microsoft Teams site. And what you can see is over here, I've got the different apps that are added. We also have our teams and our channels here to the left. So you can see we can have different channels with different group members. We can control who's a member of the group, who's not. We can actually even invite external participants if our organization allows that, so that we can collaborate with people inside and outside of our groups. And then inside of these different channels, we can customize this as well to how we work. So if you look in here, we've got this monthly report channels. I've got posts here. This is the chat. It's not like a one-on-one chat, shared chat. Everybody can see it. We also have files associated with it. So as we're working on files, we can post them here and we can work on these with our entire group, right? So we can open these Excel files. We can have multiple people in there that are making edits and improving the document, real time, on demand, and it's all shared here, or saved here behind the scenes, which is actually SharePoint, is we've got things like version control on there too. So we have the one source of truth, the master documents that we can work off of. We don't have to email back and forth for these type of things. And if you think about like any of these needed like some sort of approval, you could actually tie these workflows to that and run an approval in here, and those could be posted in here, and all your data is in one spot. These wiki is just another app tab here. So there's nothing in this one, but we can just type it in here and keep notes regarding, this project as we continue to move on. If you're familiar with OneNote, we could actually add OneNote into this as well. And I'm going to shift over here. This is integrating a Power BI report. So it's taking a minute, it's just loading up the services, and you'll see the dashboard comes up. These can be simple, these can be more complex, depending on your skill with the tools. And they're all interactive. So you can see these are built in there where I can search for things. If there's drill downs built into these reports, those drill downs will work. And I'm going to move over one more to show you real quick. Like this is a Power app that was built and then embedded into Teams here. And you will see when it comes up, it's unified, right? It's not kind of jarring like it's actually an embedded app that looks out of place. It looks like it's part of the Teams environment here. We've got interactivity. If we click it, it changes screens. And this was done on the Power App platform. All right. Let's see if I can move this guy. Why is he not? Okay. So moving in to one other feature here, outside of those collaborations and those built-in communication features, Microsoft Teams can also be integrated with normal voice services. So if you're thinking like dial in, dial out capabilities on your phone, right? You might be using something today that could be another cloud service like RingCentral, or perhaps you have a system like Cisco UCS that's deployed locally. So you can actually take those, you can move those voice services out to the cloud, and you can use Teams as that front end client. So there's a lot of benefits in doing that, right? It's no long-term carrier contracts. For those of you that are in the space and understand what's going on here, is a lot of times you might have to sign up for anywhere from 1 to 3 years on your carrier contracts directly, and they may be limited in terms of coverage and what they offer. So when you move type to that cloud voice service, that kind of goes away behind the scenes. Like, that's something that either Microsoft or what you'll see here, our partner with Scipio here, they manage any carrier contracts depending on where you are in the world and what has to be done there, and you're not dealing with any of that. There's monthly per user pricing, just like the rest of Microsoft 365. And technically you don't need equipment, right? If you go cloud in, you can use the Teams client directly. So if I'm on the desktop, I can just hit a button, get my DOB hat, I can call out, and I can use it just like our VoIP to VoIP or PC to PC calling that I might do internally. But if I want to reach somebody externally, I can just dial it out, call out, and it's going to connect me out to cell phones or other services that way. If I'm running that on my mobile, I can do the same thing there, as well as have that business line on my mobile that separates from the mobile number, right? So an incoming call to that will ring on my desktop, it rings on my mobile as well. So that can be pretty handy. You can also get devices. So while I say there's no equipment required, in some cases you may want to deploy devices. Maybe you have a common area phone or something of that nature. You can buy a Teams certified device that'll run basically a version of the Teams app, and you can place that out in your common areas. If you needed like a desk phone for reception, for instance, you can go get those as well. There's plenty of manufacturers that create these devices, and you almost can't go wrong in selecting one because, to be honest, the hardware, there's some unique things from every vendor, but they're all running the same software. They're all running Microsoft Teams, so that keeps the experience kind of unified, both in terms of how you manage it, but also how you use it, no matter where you switch devices. So it's pretty easy to manage. Once you move out to the cloud, you're not managing servers anymore. So you have an admin center in Teams. If you're familiar with Microsoft 365 and you've been managing Exchange and things like that, Teams has its own admin center that we can interact with there, and everything's in the cloud. And when we have our solution with Scipio, Scipio also has actually this nice little app that's actually built into Teams. So when you're an admin, you pull up Teams, there's the app that you click, and they've built it so you can manage things like, numbers, changing numbers, onboarding users, and managing call groups and so forth. And it's extremely slick. And again, I already noted it's kind of the unified client experience across the board. To the right, you'll see just a highlight. There's actually many more features, like call features, that are supported from Microsoft Teams from a voice standpoint. But these are just a few of those. I will say, if you're like, I have like a small help desk and I need to route calls to multiple people, it does that. We have the IVR with so you call in the automated recording and you want to route that somewhere. You need different routing between holidays and business hours. Like, that's all built into the platform. So if you're running a small type of contact center type of operations, you could actually get away with just Teams on its own for doing a lot of those functions.
Hey Zeus, you might have heard me answering a few questions there, but we did have a question on the previous one. One of them that was asked, are those reports coming from Power BI? If not, is that a potential source for the report?
The reports that I showed?
Yes.
Yeah. So the previous one I showed with Teams, that was actually a Power BI dashboard that was actually built and published in there. So essentially, in this case, that was a demo Power BI report. It was actually coming off data off an Excel sheet, and the dashboard's created in Power BI, and then you publish it as an app inside of Microsoft Teams.
And then certainly Power BI has the extensive library of sources for the information to be able to display in the report, both through the Microsoft 365 APIs directly to source some of that information if you need to bring in that, but also additional sources of on-premises, cloud, third-party applications, a pretty wide variety of places you can pull information from automatically.
Absolutely. All right, I'm going to dive a bit here into SharePoint online. So,
hey, before we do that, Jesus,
yep.
There was one more question. Just want to make sure we get this one nailed down. Are you able to use an actual desk phone similar to Ring Central? It was asked right before you kind of answered it, but would you mind diving a little bit into, kind of device compatibility, how to check that, how do we go about that, those types of things to ensure that, kind of existing phones, or if new phones, conference phones and things like that are compatible with Teams?
Yeah, definitely. So let me hang on this one a bit too. I can definitely go in more there. So when we talk about normal phones, there's a couple of categories there. So we basically have the Teams devices themselves. So again, these devices are going to run a version of the Teams app that actually comes in two flavors. You generally don't have to worry about that too much, but they will either be deployed with kind of an Android backend servicing or a Windows 10 type of device. The Windows 10s you find more in type the meeting room type devices out there, but essentially they both run Teams out there. You will manage both devices through policies and everything in the Teams admin center. And you will have varying degrees of capability on the device based on the manufacturer. So, and the policies that you put in place. So if we start with, let's say, the limited experience for a common phone, essentially all you need is a dial pad. So there is a common area license. So it's a little bit less than if you get the full user license to manage that, and you assign a common area policy to it. You'll put the device in that area, and it's just going to show the number pad. You won't see meetings or anything like that. You can just use it, dial the pad. It's going to connect to a user. So numbers only. Now, if you move up from that, you can have devices that are a little more capable. They show more of the Teams interface, and it's trimmed so it works in the phone, but you will get wider access to, say, the calendar's in there, the contact lists. You will see notifications, and you can generally interact with the touchscreen device, on the phone, just like it was on the Teams client. So that is just like the phone piece on there. And then the next one up, you actually have phones that include a video interface so that you have a little webcam on it. You can actually do, voice and video calls on the device itself. So as you can imagine, the lower end common area phones are a little bit cheaper from a product standpoint, whereas the one with like the full Teams experience and video and everything embedded on it, that's going to be on the higher end of the devices. Now, up to not that long ago, I want to say 3 or 4 months ago, that was really your only option with Teams, unless you started getting some other integrations that require some hardware to make work. But Microsoft is rolling out support for SIP-based phones in general. So what that means is any type of phone that supports SIP-based connections, which is most voice phones today, you should be able to use those here in the future soon. I believe that's still being piloted. It's still in preview, but that's going to open it up a lot of different areas for different devices. And it's going to make it easier too if you want to keep some of those older devices around, as long as they support like a generic SIP connection. So if you have another phone that is specific to a carrier, I mean, if it's a Cisco device, a Zoom device, but it doesn't support like a generic SIP connection, those wouldn't work. But if they did have that option, you might be able to maintain those and keep those around for a while. Now, that being said, that's basically only calling functionality, right? You're not going to get the full experience with the Teams app. You're just going to be able to call out from the desk phone and get calls back in, and transfer calls and simple functions like that. So moving out into those meeting rooms areas. Now, for those, you will want to have like a Teams certified meeting room if you're trying to get all into the ecosystem, right? So there's a variety of those out there, and essentially the same options that you've seen for Cisco and Zoom, and those are also available on Teams, really made by the same folks. So Yealink, Poly, and a handful of others. And those range now from simple, maybe just the audio device that you have that sits in a conference room, runs a small version of the Teams app, and you just dial in for audio, versus collaboration bars, so all-in-one devices that can be just attached to a normal TV, to full room systems that might come with special displays, ceiling speakers, and so forth. So just about any type of combination you're looking for, you can actually find those in a Teams certified device. Now, I will also add too that there are standards out there now, like WebRTC is a technical standard that's out there, and Teams, Zoom, Cisco, a lot of these guys are supporting it. But what that enables is some interop capabilities. So depending on the platform you are on and the different licensing SKUs that you have with these other platforms, you may be able to take your existing system and integrate that as well with Teams and vice versa. So what I mean by that is you might be able to have like a Zoom room system and be able to join a meeting from your Teams interface, and it will go out and it will connect over that WebRTC component there to join the Zoom interface as well. The Zoom app actually in particular is pretty neat. It has a little bot interface, so you can actually talk to Teams and tell it to start your meetings with Zoom. Cisco's somewhat similar. They have a function where you can connect WebEx to Teams, and they work vice versa. If you're on WebEx, you can kind of join a Teams meeting joining a WebEx meeting. So there's some interop there available across systems as well. That being said, when you're rolling it out, as we talked about roadmap and making these decisions, we also talk to folks about how we do that. It's not always economical to look at it and say go away from one solution completely and then move into Teams. Very, very commonly, especially with Cisco, we use Teams. We'll roll that out. That's the individual communications, small team communications, but the investment in like the Cisco room systems are pretty heavy, and we're probably not going to rip those out. So, the big web conferencing stuff, when you're showing up in there in the executive conferences, they'll just continue to use that. And, they run side by side, and there's no problem there. We have any other voice questions? All right. So we're going to move away from Teams a bit, not too far though. We're going to talking about SharePoint Online. So with Teams, you remember that graph I showed, it talks to a lot of different things. SharePoint is actually a really big part of Microsoft Teams. Essentially, all of the files and the documents that we share inside of a team are getting stored on SharePoint. So that's a good thing though, because we are getting that unified experience, all the documents in one place. Our version control is there, our access controls are there, but we can go a little bit further as well. So when you're just thinking about SharePoint on its own, I grabbed this screen grab here just kind of to show is we can also layer in kind of that traditional intranet type of pages, department pages. Those would go more on the SharePoint side versus the Microsoft Teams side. And again, if you're coming back from an older version of the servers that are out there, 2007, 2010 that you've seen, the editing experience is much better here in SharePoint Online. It's a modern editor. It's point and click. You don't have different screens you're navigating through too often. You literally could, hand off a page creation template after showing them how to access it to say, hey, this is how you access it, and you could give it to like a marketing or a comm team with very little training. In very little time, they would figure out the interface on how to create these pages. And these pages are all dynamic. So as you can see here, they will collapse. They will show in different aspects, whether you're on your phone, whether you're on your desktop or you're on a tablet. And there's also an app. So a lot of these things that we're talking about, Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, Forms, Microsoft actually has dedicated apps on phone platforms like iOS and Android. As well as having it show up, in a format that's readable if you just access it directly over the web. So you'll also see in the back, right, we kind of have a Teams screenshot back here where we can display those pages as well. So when I have my Microsoft Teams open and I have a site that I've created and I'm working on it, maybe it's a project that we're going and I'm integrating other things in there, I might want to utilize that SharePoint page to convey some other information that's more static, and I can just move to that tab and place those things there. So it integrates directly in there, and we can access those pages. So it actually looks like it's part of the team, and I don't have to push people out to a different web browser for that, as well as taking advantage of the storage options that are behind there. So by default, Teams creates one folder for every channel in Teams. So what that means is I can have maybe a team that's one group of people working on multiple things, and each channel might be like a different project, and that's going to create a different folder behind the scenes. But I may need other organizational assets. Maybe those are shared in another team or another SharePoint site, for instance. I can bring those into my Teams environment as well, and that's all integrating with SharePoint. So if you remember, again, I said how SharePoint as a product, as a name, it's kind of falling back a bit because we're using different ways to get to that same content. So where's SharePoint good? When you're talking about SharePoint versus Teams, when you think about a one-to-many type of conversation, SharePoint is great at that, right? Where Teams is definitely favored more for collaboration and working with a group and working on files and co-editing. Sometimes with SharePoint, you just want to get things out. You just want your intranet page where you can publish out information that's shared across to everyone, or maybe you have different notification options that you want to be published and controlled. So, marketing might have something, HR might have something. You can create that mechanism for them where internally they manage that, and then when it gets approved, it's pushed up kind of to an aggregated site in SharePoint, and then everybody has access to that. And as we saw with Teams, where I can publish a dashboard in that might be relevant for something specific, right? So if I have my sales team, I want my sales metrics specific to the team, I might publish in there. But maybe I have a different set of those metrics I want to share org-wide, right? Or make more of an aggregated function. I can drop those on SharePoint as well. So because Power BI is like, cloud-based, we can put those in multiple different places. SharePoint also is kind of the background of our digitalization process and digitization process that works along with Teams. So when we put content into SharePoint, the two big ones are like the web page, the web-facing content that you see, and then libraries that you'll see as the second bullet here. That's where all the files are stored. Now, we can also use what are called lists. So you can think of lists, if you haven't experienced that, is a trimmed down version of Excel in the cloud, but it's just always in the cloud. You're not opening an Excel file, right? But you're going to have your data in this tabular format, just like you would have in Excel. And you can really create apps and drive processes off that, because you can create forms that capture data that drop that in a list. That list can kick off a workflow that maybe goes out and sends that data somewhere else, either for approval, or maybe it goes to some other list that then it's going to be processed later. Or it could, do some data massaging for that ends up in a Power BI report. So it's pretty powerful both as a storage mechanism and to trigger other things off of that. So Power Apps is actually built into SharePoint online as well. And what we can do there is you can take that list, you can create your table that you're going to have with your data in it, and then there's a button that says create an app from here. If you click that, it moves you over to Power Apps, automatically ties your data to that list and gives you an app to start with. It gives you a default app where you can view the data, edit the data, add new items without really doing anything further there. So that is pretty powerful on its own. And a complement of SharePoint is going to be OneDrive. So OneDrive is actually part of SharePoint, but it looks a little different, and its purpose is a little bit different. So where SharePoint, I want to share that out with lots of people. I want lots of people to have access to it. OneDrive are really like my files. So if you have an H drive and a home drive today on networks, you can think of OneDrive as something that can replace that. And this has a lot of the same benefits as SharePoint, right? Is we can really go ahead and access it, anyway at different devices, and take our data with us. And it's our data. We interact with it with Office apps. We can also invite people to work with us on these documents that we're working on, just like we could in SharePoint. So it's pretty powerful there. We built in search. We have our files, and probably the big one is when we talk about storage. So all of the SKUs that you get here with OneDrive, I should say the big SKUs. There's a thing called a frontline SKU that has a very small OneDrive limit. I think it's like 2 GB currently, but typically those users aren't using OneDrive. But when you move up to the bigger SKUs, Business Premium, the E3s, E5s, we're gonna have a minimum of 1 TB available per user. And on the enterprise SKUs, E3 and E5, you can actually move that up. So there's a quota 1 TB by default, but you can actually move that up to 5 TB per user, that's a lot of space. And think about typically on a home drive how much we control that, and we force users kind of to trim things down. So there's a lot of power in that, a lot of availability in the cloud for moving your data up there and freeing things up locally. So a few more reasons why we might look at OneDrive, right? We talked about the access anywhere, but when you have it, especially on like a Mac or a Windows 10 device, you can sync files for offline access. So I can essentially get it and see my files like they are in the File Explorer view of my native operating systems. So users don't need a lot of training to utilize it, right? You go in, you turn it on, and now you can just tell users, it's here, it's in your Explorer, go here, you can save files here, and they're always protected. There's another feature on Windows 10 that goes along with this, and it's what they call known folder moves. So it's folder redirection. So if you've done this in the past and redirected, your desktop and document folders to your home drives on the servers, we can now do that with OneDrive by default. So now I drop something on my desktop, I drop something in documents, it's going to get synced up to the cloud and automatically protected. And another slick feature of this is when we talk about like the modern management pieces later, is that helps with the restoring of personal files, right? Because that's all now in the cloud. You get a new machine, turn it on, just turn on your known Windows folder move there, and those files pop back up. And you're also having a benefit there of not really, killing bandwidth from that standpoint too, because of the files on demand feature that's available. So what that means is the files show up. It looks like you could see them on your desktop, but they're not actually downloaded until I click them. So once I click them, they will download it, and the files are there, and they will stay in sync. And at any point, if I want to free up that space, let's say I'm done working on them or working on a folder, you can also go in and just say, hey, I only want to keep this online only, and it will clean all of that up for you. So it's an incredibly powerful feature. It works really, really well, and is probably one of the biggest reasons actually to move to OneDrive specifically versus managing things like those, those home drives and things like that. We talked a bit, or I hinted on it, like versioning of files. So versioning of files here, and the file restores with 30-day protection. This is important because both from a user standpoint and enabling it is, we want to be able to keep the changes that are in there. So you don't want to have to go back and pull from a backup because somebody accidentally changed the file, right? And we've been having that for a while. We have the shadow copies on Windows 10, and we have our backup platforms on the home drive so that we can go in and pull them out. But that's a pretty expensive operation. Here, the users have this power to revert back and pull to a new version, or pull up versions side by side in Office with this capability and move the changes or merge the changes on their own if they need to pull something back. In the event a user is compromised with something like malware, if that malware, say, encrypts files locally on a device, it might encrypt all the local synced files, which, yes, because they're physical files, they will sync up to the cloud and they could potentially encrypt it. But because we have this version control out there, there's actually a method in there that will revert all of your files back to a date and time. So you can go into the interface, click a button, say, hey, revert to 2 days ago, and it puts all your files back in place, right? So your files, you know, have a level of protection there from there.
Hey,
OneDrive.
Jesus.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt your mojo there, but another question coming in. As an administrator, are we able to see what users are sharing files to outside clients via OneDrive?
So you can go in and do some audits on what's being shared, and there are different mechanisms to do that. There are audit logs in place to see where that is done. You can actually go in and do audits on, say, your external users that are invited. You can do an audit on, there's a function in there for like anonymous sharing links, and you can do an audit and see how many of those are out there. Now, because they're anonymous, you can only see that they're active and they're out there. But, you know, between the audit logs, access logs, you can see what's being, you know, accessed and shared out from there. And you can control some of that if you need to. And this is one that's touchy depending on organizations, because you can control where documents are shared. So for instance, you can lock down OneDrive and say, you can't share this outside of the company. And you might lock down SharePoint the same way, but maybe you might create a very specific site with SharePoint and change that policy. So anything placed here can be shared externally. That's a way kind of to funnel that out depending on the organizational needs. If you need to do that, you can also start looking to layer in protections in some cases with the DLP sensitivity labels, and some other security tools that are available in there to help control some of that without limiting what a user can do. And I would just be very careful with that. And it's one of the things we talk about when we do our roadmap sessions is understand how do users work today. Because when you look at it, you might be thinking, oh, this is a risk. People shouldn't be able to do this. I think you have to understand what they're actually doing today, because a lot of cases you're going to find out, hey, I don't want them to do this. I want to lock it down, but all you're doing is making the problem invisible to yourself because they're actually using Dropbox or something else behind the scenes, or even sending it via email. So you're not actually mitigating your risk from that standpoint. You're actually increasing your risk because you're not seeing what's happening. So you have to kind of weigh those options as you're determining what to lock down or what not to lock down. Okay, so moving on here,
A couple more questions rolling in here. Sorry to keep going. Can there be more than 30 days? This was the file store and 30-day retention question.
Yes and no. So yes, you can basically you can host different versions indefinitely, but the file restore with the 30-day protection is really the big bang switch. So if I need to go in and revert everything in my OneDrive back to a previous day, it only lets me go back to that 30 days from there. But we can have retention placed on documents, a retention rule that will essentially keep it in perpetuity, and continue to add those different versions. So yes, it's out there. Yes, you can hold it longer than that, but if you want to restore beyond that, that's kind of on a file by file basis, or you would have to have that either a tool or a scripted function to do that and walk through the documents if you wanted to, say, convert an entire OneDrive 32 days previously.
Yeah, I would just expand upon that a little bit. You know, when we talk about, you know, kind of 30-day retention, that's, you know, the 30-day retention that Microsoft is providing to kind of prevent, you know, various accidents, malicious things. There's a lot of reasons for it, obviously. But going beyond 30 days, there are capabilities to do things like, you know, legal and litigation hold, and I'll drop this into the chat. But also, what is common if you have, from a legal or risk management or just a corporate policy standpoint, you have a retention policy for records beyond 30 days, and you need some level of assurance of that. Depending on what data protection solutions you're using in your cloud, like Azure, or you're in your data center, a lot of those solutions like Rubrik, Cohesive, Veeam, you know, on down the line, even some of your spam, third-party spam protection solutions on the front end for email, and some of the documents have backup solutions for Office 365 where they can store that information securely in their cloud. You can drop it to a storage account inside of an Azure subscription, or even bring that information back on premises to meet lengthier retention policies. So that's something very, very common that you would see in a organization that has any type of compliance to hold information for 1 or 2 years, sometimes 7, 10. Sometimes we see it like we're going to hold everything indefinitely, depending on what the organization's posture is on that, and really what advice is coming from the risk management and legal, as well as HR departments on document and data retention. So to summarize that, the way I would look at it is, what's our policy, from an organization standpoint? What do we need to meet? That's the first question you want to answer. And then looking at your existing ecosystem of solutions, do we already have something that can do this? And then from there, walking into some other things like, AvePoint has a great solution just to pull your information from Office 365 and bunker it somewhere else without a lot of fanfare or additional infrastructure required. So lots of different ways to solve that. But the first question you want to ask is, what is the policy we're trying to meet?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's lots of conversation and planning that can go into that, depending how granular you need to get and how much coverage you definitely need. So the last two items I'll hit here, co-editing in Office documents. We talked about that kind of in SharePoint and Teams. Just the power of that, right? When you're opening Word or Excel, that comes from it being stored in like OneDrive or SharePoint, right? So it's not built necessarily directly into the Office platform. If you keep it, on a home drive, you don't get that capability. So you have to take advantage of these spaces to store them to gain that. And the other thing, when we talked about the sync client, how you can see it in your file explorer on Mac or Windows, is you can also use that to sync SharePoint files as well. So if you're working in a group, you have your OneDrive files, you could be working like a marketing department and they work on their collateral. They could also sync their library file there from Teams or their SharePoint site and have that available to them locally as well, and it works the same way. You have the same file on demand features. It only downloads what you want to open, and you can always say keep online, and it will save the space there. So that's pretty powerful as well. And I'm gonna drop right back down. I'm gonna make this a little smaller so that I don't lose my bar. One thing here, if we go down and open an app back with SharePoint, we will see this here. So this is the simple packaged app. That's not hard to do, but when I click it, it looks separate here. It's actually going to load a SharePoint page. So this is a SharePoint page. It's a modern page. As you can see, the layout is basically what you see on the web today. I could go directly to SharePoint and open this, but this is in my Teams here. So this can be handy where if I want this page in a team, I might just add it as a tab because it's related to the department. But if I have like a bigger intranet page, there's always the question, well, where do I use my intranet? And if I'm always in Teams, I'm probably not going out to my intranet. You can actually bundle your intranet up and put it right here in the Teams client. So when it comes to files as well, we were talking about OneDrive. That actually is right here. So if I click into that, this is my OneDrive and Teams here. If I click this, I'm going to see all the documents for the groups and things that I've shared. And down here, I can access my OneDrive as well. So in addition to it being local and going directly to the cloud and accessing it, I can do it right here in Teams. And if I want to share something out with somebody from Teams, I can do that in here. So kind of highlighting again how Teams is that hub that's bringing all of these tools together so you can work directly inside of that tool. All right, so next we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about ways that you can actually extend, Teams, and all of these tools as well work outside of Teams, and you can integrate them with SharePoint and the other tools that Microsoft has as well. But they do work directly in Teams, again, which brings everything together, and that's what Microsoft is calling now their Power Platform. They have 4 tools. So these are their little icons here on the left. The purple one is Power Apps for building, forms and forms with business logic and, simple routing rules. And you can interact with different data sources. This blue one here, this arrow, is Automate. So you can create workflows from here. The dialog boxes is what is called Power Virtual Agents, which lets you build bots like Q&A bots that you can interact with. And then we have Power BI on the right. So with Power Apps, it's really what it sounds like. It's a service for building applications. That's really where it started. But it can start anything from simple forms to more complex things. So this here is kind of the interface. You notice it's like drag and drop. There's not too much going on here. I can fill in my properties on my form, and I have objects here like text boxes and things that I can add. So if you've ever done anything in Word or built a form in Word or anything like that, you really could get started with Power Apps here fairly simply. And when you build your Power Apps, probably the easiest way to get started is what I mentioned before. When we're in SharePoint and we build a list, you just click the Power Up button, and now you can build a form over the top of that and access that through a variety of methods. The other way to do it is actually inside of Microsoft Teams. So when you're inside of Microsoft Teams, you actually get some additional benefits. And that is, the big one is what they call Dataverse. So it's essentially like a database. And again, if you think Excel, you can store your files in here, but it's available to you inside of Microsoft Teams, and it's just there. So you go into Teams, build it, set what you want there, and it connects the form up to that, and you can start building your forms right inside of Microsoft Teams. So somewhat similar to the SharePoint example there. Now, there are some considerations there in how things are accessed. If you build your Power Apps in Microsoft Teams, it's only available inside of Teams. So you can access it from your phone or anywhere else as long as it's through the Teams client. However, if we did something like from SharePoint and we build an app from there, or we just go into Power Apps directly and build our app, that app is then available on the web. It has a URL you can publish and access to it. It also has an app that you can download to your phone and access it from there. You can embed that in SharePoint as well as other places, and you can access it across the ecosystem. So depending on where you build the app will control some of that access and what's available to you. Now, if you keep it in Teams, which is probably where I recommend you start unless you have something specific you're going to build there with from the SharePoint side of things. You get access to the Dataverse, which is not available to you, at least with the Microsoft 365 platform outside of that. So when you're outside of Teams, you can use an Excel sheet that's stored in OneDrive, and it has to be in OneDrive or SharePoint. You can use the SharePoint list there, and that's about it for your data storage. If you want to reach out and talk to SQL or something like that, you can, but that requires additional licensing to get there. So if you use Teams, you get the Dataverse, you get the built-in database, and it already has some things that are called entities. So if you want to collect user information, it has like the database tables in there for first name, last name, phone number, and so forth that you can reutilize there. So that's a big benefit there because you can't get that when you're outside of Teams. Another one that's really going to go in here when we're talking about Power Apps, Power Automate, and virtual agents is what it can connect to. So there are different connectors that you can utilize for talking to data sources. And for the most part, if you're outside of Teams, you want to talk to a third-party service, you've got to go with a higher level licensing for both creating it and for your users. So as I noted, talking to SQL, or if you want to talk to another SaaS application, that requires a separate license. If you're inside of Teams, however, this is a little bit more dev focused. Microsoft does provide you the access to talk to their Azure API management service. So what that means is you would talk to that API service, but you would have a developer, somebody help you publish items behind that, right? So Workday, Salesforce, anything like that, you could publish that behind that API management there. Teams talks to it there. That's how you would interact with those services.
Hey, Jesus,
yeah.
Quick question. Is there a relational database behind the Power Apps is the Dataverse you were speaking about?
You can connect them in there. It's not like a fully relational system, but you can build the logic in there for that. If you wanted to talk to something like SQL or a full relationship database like Azure Cosmos, that needs more of the Premier connectors that you have to move up from. So you don't get automatic access to that from just your Microsoft 365 licensing. So I know that might sound confusing because it's the way they've set it up. pseudo relational with what they have in there. But if you're building those in there, you kind of have to build in the glue that makes it that way. Yeah, so Power Apps again is they promote it as a low code platform, but it really can be considered no code as well.
Before we move on to that one, to
Yeah.
kind of clarify that question a little bit, to be clear, are there any additional license needs if looking to use Dataverse and SharePoint?
Yes. So if you want to go off and build your app and make it available in SharePoint, then you do need the dedicated Power Automate licenses, which opens that up to you. So there would be a licensing that you need, both in terms of building it, but also all of your users that access it also need that higher license. So that's a pretty important consideration there as far as your planning goes, because there's different ways to license it. There's basically what they call per app models. So essentially you get a license, a user can access, I believe it's up to 5 apps that you build, and you can swap them out. It's just coverage for that as far as it goes. If you build more than that, you need additional licensing. But then there's kind of the open unlimited seed, right? There's a cost, every user gets it, and it doesn't matter how many apps you build, they can access it and utilize it, as well as like the premium connectors and the extra services in the Dataverse side of things. Does that make sense? Was I clear on that?
So far, so good. I'll
right.
add if there's anything else that gets published, but good question. And we can certainly dive into like the licensing nuances. It really just depends on the scale and breadth of you're going to use it. When you look at, it's kind of like servers. Is it you're going to use it per server? You're going to use it per core? Different things like that. The licensing model that you want to use really fits the specific use case and the scale in which you're going to use it. So it's something we can take offline. If you want to provide a little bit more information to us, send us an email, and then we can kind of come back with a more specific answer to that use case.
Right. Yeah, and I will just throw out there, there are some scenarios here where it's more on the next session we talk about Power Automate, but there's a Logic Apps is the platform in Azure, which can also shift the licensing question and how something's used. So it's more architecture that we're talking about in there, but I think it's an important consideration when you're designing these to kind of look at both approaches to see what's going to make the most sense. So moving on, just to summarize here, right? Microsoft positions this as a low-code platform, but in some scenarios it is no-code because there are some out-of-the-box examples you can just plug in and work with and maybe just tweak a bit. You don't have to code per se or add logic to it. The SharePoint example where you have your list and just hit the button, they give you an app that just works. So in those cases, there's nothing for you to do. Drag and drop, change some colors, you're good. Now, low-code means you're not going to jive in. You don't have to use JavaScript and C# or C++ and those type of things, but you can build logic and flows into these apps, business logic's in there, but it does follow the same format as like Excel, right? So it's not one-to-one in Excel in there, but if you've done anything with complex formulas in Excel, which is kind of the original low-code app platform, you can translate that skill set really into what you're doing into Power Automate and Power Apps and virtual agents and stuff that we get into. So there is a learning curve. There are some advanced functions that you can get in there, but just getting started, to be quite honest, if you sat down on your own, again, assuming you're somewhat comfortable with how Excel functions work, you know half a day you could build a form and get going based with the examples and things. So that's like my next bullet. Again, you can do simple forms. You can also do complex apps with different business logic, different forms, different interactions, different screens, just anything you would think is like from an app, you can actually build in Power Automate. I think a few people have even gone in, they've actually created like small mobile games out of the platform. That would be on the higher end of the complexity there. So, again, your apps, when you build them, it's accessible, anywhere, whether you start in the Power Automate platform, you build it inside of Teams, of course, wherever Teams is available, or you have internet access, those forms are available. And that's a good thing to note there too, is outside of Teams, when you're building your Power Automate, if you have a dedicated app for a function, you can actually build some offline components into those as well. So the apps and teams we talked about, it just gives you a little bit more expandability in what you can talk to, and really you're letting users solve their business problems. So that's the big thing, right? When you have somebody that's motivated, they want to get in, they want to do it, they can get in and start doing it. They can play with it. They can say, okay, this is how it's going to solve my function here, and at least give you that first iterative function on what they need, and then potentially IT can come in, help guide them a little bit, and then help them move it up kind of the life cycle stack as it matures. So moving away from Power Apps, which is kind of the front end of the process, and you can do some logic behind there, but we have Power Automate, which is their bigger workflow engine. So Automate is going to plug into a lot of the services in Microsoft 365 already. They already have the plug and play capabilities. For instance, if I get an email, I can create a flow that then sends me an SMS message. Or if I get an alert in Teams, I can trigger something off somebody putting something in Teams that maybe I want to capture that document and save it out to OneDrive. So I can move things around to different services. So with Power Automate for Office 365, you can talk to all of those services, and that's included. Now, as I alluded to before, if you want to talk to an external service, there's some additional licensing requirements there. When you get in and look at connectors, there's essentially what they call standard connectors, which means you can use it with your M365 license, and all of the Microsoft 365 services are in there. And then there's advanced or premium connectors. Those require a different license type. So an example here is, again, if I'm automating something here for my online service, but I want to talk to something local. I want to run it through some type of gateway or proxy and then talk to my local SQL server, for instance. That would be a premium connector, and that requires a different licensing consideration. So Power Automate itself is also the no-code, low-code. This is a quick screen grab of how the flows look when you go in and you turn it on. You can do different functions in here. You can basically take data in, you can manipulate it. In this example, we're changing the time input that comes in, but you can change text, you can add text, change values that go out. We can branch out there with different conditions that we have. Think about like different approval flows. If person A approves this, then it goes to person B, or if person A doesn't respond in 30 days, maybe it's going to go over to person B, or maybe it's going to go down both, and the first one to respond will then approve it and it will come back. So this all happens essentially from one system that kicks off the flow. Data moves into your flow here down this stack, and then it will have an output, and you can direct basically just anything you can imagine at this point, especially on the Microsoft 365, anything that goes in here. And there's defaults, or not default, but built-in activities that you can do in here, like the email scenario. I can just go in, I don't have to code anything, it's point and click. I can say, if I get this email from this person, trigger this flow, and I want to send an SMS message, put my number in it, and like it's done. It's very simple. But I can also get pretty complex in there with some of these other iterative loops and things that I add in there when building these out. So like Power Apps, it also is the no-code and the low-code platform. You can do like some drag and drop items in here and do some simple scenarios. There's a lot of pre-built kind of packages in there. So when you first go into Power Automate, the screen shows up and it gives you examples of what you want to do. And you can start with those. Makes it very, very easy, right? So that's more towards the no-code part of that, but then you can modify those and increase those capabilities. And you can actually get input here. So there's a little bit of overlap when we think about how Power Apps starts with a form. You can create forms and inputs and interactions in these flows as well. So I can actually have it trigger an email that goes out, and that email may have two buttons that you want to push, and you click it and it goes back to the Automate flow. So these are called kind of active cards, display cards in there. There's a whole interface for designing it. It's like a drag and drop interface, and you just have the card how you want, and that goes in there. When somebody pushes the button or they put data or text, whatever you want to collect in that flow, it will come back and be as part of that flow. And you can do it like email is one active normal way of doing that, but Teams chats as well. You can drop that same thing in a Teams chat and have that interaction in that flow. So pretty powerful. again, we're integrating services, a lot of them out of the box, especially the Microsoft 365 side of things. We can go and just pull them all in, talk to the different services, move things around. And it doesn't take a lot to get started. As far as the low-code options, again, it's very similar to the Excel language when you get in there and start designing them. I can say if you start getting into some of the advanced data manipulation, that gets a little more complicated. And if you're talking to like custom APIs, which you would need advanced license, that one's a little harder if you're not familiar with how APIs work, because there is a lot of talking to the open API, what is a JSON response, and those type of things. So a normal user would probably need some assistance in that part of it. So speaking of that, Power Automate is really based around a user-centric flow. Now you can open it up and create items so other people can run your flows like on SharePoint and so forth. But it's still user-centric, and there are still some gotchas. So for instance, if I create and I own the Power Automate flow, and it's a business process that we're using in the department, but I leave, you can't currently reassign ownership of that, right? So if you want to have that reassigned, you almost have to rebuild that. So the good thing is you can export all of it and then re-import it, plug everything back in, and you can do that fairly quickly. But if you reach something that's starting to scale, and it makes sense that it becomes a much higher level, purpose tool, that might be where you start to look at moving that into that service I mentioned earlier with Azure Logic Apps. These share the same platform. So the Power Automate actually does run on Logic Apps. So you can take that, you can export the flow there, drop it into Logic Apps. There's a little rewiring that has to be done there, but now you're running that more as like an enterprise level service. There are some considerations there because there are some triggers in Automate that don't exist over there, but a lot of times we can figure out different ways around that, and that changes your licensing conversation as well. It goes from a per user based licensing to a consumption based licensing based on how that's running out in Azure. So this one, Power Virtual Agents, this is available externally outside of Teams as well, but always requires a separate licensing for that. If you want to use Power Virtual Agents with your Microsoft 365 licensing, you have to do it from inside of Teams. And what it does is it lets you build a conversational flow with the bot inside of Teams. It is a drag and drop interface, as you can see here on the screen. Very easy to get started and to build. The first time you open it, you'll start with what's called a Q&A bot. And essentially, it's an example of how do I program a bot to look at a list of questions and then give a response. And if you're thinking like, where does this help, internally, it's kind of like that next evolution maybe of a search engine where I can have a controlled experience here. For instance, I can add it in here and I'll have it as an app, and I just want it to respond, say, to HR requests. Where are my policies? Where's my handbook? It can then spit it out, give you the link, and it's all there in the interface. I don't have to go navigate somewhere to find it. If I want to share information on it, I can program that into the bot. It's all text-based, so people can get in and do it without a lot of training there. Now you can get more advanced as well. So like the Automate flows, we can take input and we can take action off that. You'll see here we're asking a question in the screenshot, so we can collect information and then respond off it. But you tie that to Automate, it can actually go do something. You can take that response, for instance, and maybe send an email out that says somebody needs help, or you need to take some of that data that you're asking for and put that in a SharePoint list or an Excel file or something. You can then do something with that data that's happening here with the bot as well. So lots of different scenarios that can be pretty powerful. And again, we're talking no code, low code platform. There's really not a lot of code here from the bot side of things inside of Teams. Again, if we want to use it outside of Teams, there's some additional licensing available there. And I will say this also has an Azure component as well. So what Microsoft calls the bot framework, that's what underlays all of this. And if you have a dev team and you have a bigger enterprise application of this and you want to say push this external, or even let's say you want this bot to be available internal and on Facebook or a completely non-Microsoft platform that supports bots, you would use that Azure platform. But again, that does require some development work to actually do that and create that front end, but it's all the same system underneath. And I'm going to drop down here so that you can see in Teams, if I go down, I have a bot here. This was it's a simple bot. You can see it's answering questions. And if we just say like, you know, what are your hours? This is the default bot. It should kick back with the hours, right? And then it's like, hey, yes, my question's answered. And then it should ask me how the feedback was. Yep. And I'm going to say it was a 3. And that it's as simple as that. And literally, you guys could go in today, go into Teams, search for your apps, look for Power Virtual Agents, drop it in there. You're going to open it up, say, let's get started. Take the default bot. You're going to publish it to a Teams to the Teams channel there, and then just click Open Bot, and you'll be here. And you could actually play with this, and then you could go see the logic behind the scenes on how the text and everything is being organized for the responses and the queries. It really is that simple. Now, of course, the complexity is getting that data together. What do you want the bot to do? What questions do you want it to ask? What variations of questions as well? So, you know, I said, what are your store hours? But, you know, other variations like what are your hours or when you open, you can program those different things in there to provide those responses as well. All right, so the last one was Power BI, and we've hit on this a few times. We've talked about that, right? That's Microsoft's new visualization engine. If you've been working at Microsoft for a while, you know they've had SQL Server, they've had their SQL Server reporting services. Power BI is a little different from that because it decouples it from any particular backend service, and you can talk to different data repositories, including, you know, external services. You can pull data in for anybody that really exposes an API, for instance, and bring that into your Power BI workspace. Now, a couple of considerations with licensing are important here. It's that you don't get a license like you do with the other ones. So Power Apps, Power Automate, you can use with Office 365 inside or outside of Teams. Power Virtual Agents, you get that as long as you use it inside of Teams. Power BI, there's a free individual version of it. I could create a dashboard. I can have my data here, but I can't really share it out, right? I get full functionality for me, but I can't share it with my team. I can't publish it to SharePoint. For that, you need a paid license that either comes in the E5 SKU or a standalone SKU to get that capability. So that's a pretty important consideration if you want to start sharing these dashboards across SharePoint or Microsoft Teams. You have to consider the licensing aspect of that. So, you know, we saw an example of the dashboards that you can do in there. We can actually connect flows in there, so you can create essentially an action button in your dashboard that will trigger some type of action in a flow with Power BI. You can even embed these in those Power Apps. So if I have Power Apps out there, consider maybe I have a sales catalog that I've drawn up in Power Apps, and behind the scenes, my admins are going to get access to the data on like live data, like how are things out there in the catalog. I could tie that in and actually put that in Power Apps. And, you know, if everybody has a license, of course, the self-service analytics part is you can design it yourself. There's a little bit of a ramp up there, but you can create the dashboards in a way that users can actually use the data, where you present one view of the data, but allow things like drill downs and modifications and transforms, and you can build that into your dashboards, and then users can get their own view of that data. So that's really what that means by self-service analytics. So, Jason, any questions come up around Power BI or virtual agents that I hit on that?
Not in the Q&A.
All right, so I'm going to move here real quick of what we're seeing as a value add here. Some new things that you're probably not into yet, but may have seen. So, virtual reality, mixed reality, augmented reality are starting to get more prominence with Microsoft. They recently had their Ignite conference earlier in the year, and they actually had their keynote done in a kind of a virtual reality setting. With they were introducing a program called Microsoft Mesh, and they have a meetings virtual reality thing that's built on that. But they're going more into that area and introducing that out, and they are building that into Microsoft 365. And there's two areas today you can really start playing with this. One is SharePoint. SharePoint has an item in there called SharePoint Spaces. Now you have to turn it on. There's an administrative function to actually turn that on, and you have to enable it in the site. But it gives you assets, just like you would build a web page. You will build the space by adding components on there. You don't program it. You're not moving your camera around necessarily, but you can add things like a video wall, a presentation here. And as you can see in the screenshot, this presents it in 2D space. And if you were actually in Teams, you can move around with your mouse in a kind of that 3D view, almost game-like, right, and interact with it. But if I had a mixed reality headset, whether it's a HoloLens or maybe I think Oculus works with it, and some of the lower end headsets as well, you could actually interact that in VR space, 360, fully interactive there. So that's out there on everybody's subscription now today. Like, you can turn it on, you can actually go play with that. The other one is they've actually just released an augmented reality into Power Apps. So there are actual augmented reality components that you can add in here. So right now it's more focused around like adding a 3D model into a scene. So as you can see here, we have a 3D model of a forklift, but we can put it in the app here and then move it around, see what does it look like in my environment. So you can do that with any number of things. If you actually have like a physical product that you're working with, you could build an app that would show that in the environment. And I think we've all seen a lot of, if you go buy furniture or things like that, you can, I think even Amazon has that, like, hey, see this in your living room now. That basically brings this functionality here. And you can use, pre-built models, or if you have someone that builds 3D models, it supports the normal 3D file formats already, and you can import them in here and use that function. There are some basic functions in here as well. So is like there's a kind of a virtual reality kind of a measuring function where you could measure a room, see what it looks like, take your door measurements, and you can take that and ping that with a flow, pull that data out, which can then be input like to a database, and then you can take action on that as well. So you can imagine advanced scenarios here where I'm putting something in, I need to measure a room, I've got those measurements, maybe that kicks out to a list, which is tied to like a sales order that puts all of that stuff in there, and collects all that information for you. So these are still early stages, but they're going to continue to build on it. As I said, there's more technology that Microsoft's doing around this. They even have a whole Microsoft Mesh platform, and I think we're going to see that being integrated into more of these products as time goes on. Okay, so Q&A, I think we hit that. Are we good? Is we have any open questions? Any questions that you want to highlight, Jason, that maybe we've answered in the chat?
No, nothing specific to highlight. I think there's been some good questions around licensing and things like that, and I responded privately to a few that I didn't publish. That the answer is all too often it depends. So my challenge is without specific details, because the good news is there's a lot of different ways we can manipulate licensing to be the right size, best fit for what you specifically need in your use case to get you the best price, the best fit, just what you need. The bad news is there's a lot of different ways we can manipulate licensing, and it's all too confusing at times. So the best way to approach that is to really understand the need, irrespective of licensing, so that we can then kind of dial into specifically how do we solve that need in the most economic and efficient way possible. So when it comes to things like Power Apps, Power BI, particularly some of the service-based licensing, different things around securities in this as well, which we're talking about next. Feel free to reach out. Let's have a quick conversation about the specific need, and just please use this as a resource to kind of help you narrow down on that alongside your Microsoft team as well. So with that, looks like we're right on schedule. Let's take a short 5-minute break. We'll be back to talk about cloud security at 10:37 Eastern time. So right now we'll just take a quick pause, and then Jesus will take us right into cloud security. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for all the great questions during the first segment. Coming up in our second segment, we're going to talk about something that is extremely popular in our day-to-day conversations with clients, which is the topic of security and what does it mean to be secure, particularly in a world, the cloud, which things like identity, people, devices, everything has moved beyond the four walls of the office, the four walls of the data center, beyond the firewall from an identity management standpoint. And what does it mean to be secure enough? There's kind of a great saying out there that there's no such thing as secure enough. You're either secure or you're not secure. But organizations today are constantly faced with evolving security challenges to meet that threshold of being secure, faced with unknown threats and all kinds of zero-day threats and different actors out there. So what we'll talk a little bit about is Microsoft 365's approach to security. Well, actually, tomorrow we'll have another conversation around preventative things and security within Azure from an infrastructure and a platform as a service standpoint. But we'll dive into this a little bit, and we'll talk about all the capabilities that Microsoft 365 has, but in particular, how the cloud allows you with less effort to stay on the forefront of those evolving threats without constantly having to reinvent or redeploy or upgrade or remediate gaps within your security, whether it's at the end users, whether it's at the firewall level, identity and access management, all of those capabilities. So with that, I think it's a great topic, something that, again, that's extremely timely and always timely. I'll turn it back over to Jesus to start walking us through it. Jesus, I'll let you take it away.
All right, thanks. All right, so in this section, over security, we're gonna talk a bit about the modern endpoint management suite there, which really falls into what Jason just told you about. We're gonna run through. I had my introduction slide, but I think most of you are still with me from early, so we're gonna skip through that, jump right into Azure AD. That's the core identity platform for all of the Microsoft tools, and that's really where anything with security actually starts. And then we're going to go into the modern endpoint management from the Microsoft perspective and how that works. Same thing, if we have some Q&A, we'll just drop in the middle, but anything at the end, we'll cover that as well. And we're going to go right in here. Okay, so this is me again. I'm not going to spend time on here. If you're just joining us, I've been with eGroup well over 8.5 years. I'm the director of cloud services, and I have a pretty deep background on the Microsoft stack, and especially on the cloud, really since the cloud started taking off. So Microsoft 365 and Azure, we do a lot there. And this slide here, I know there's a lot. It's kind of like what I showed you with the collaboration slide. If you remember that, where we started that, these are all the different security services that Microsoft is bundling into their entire ecosystem. Portions of these that you get depend on the SKUs in your licensing, and there's probably even a few that I left off. But you can see on the far left, we're looking at Windows 10 itself and what's baked into there and how that works with some of the services. We also have to consider integrations, right, with our on-premises workflows. So a lot of that's a hybrid deployments. There's some companies we know that they're all in, they're all cloud. We've gone all cloud, and that's fine. But the majority of folks actually have some sort of hybrid interconnect in their cloud deployments, right? A lot of public private clouds. Usually at minimum that starts with Active Directory, and that may go out from there depending on what's deployed and in use. And there are tools and services available in the ecosystem to handle that scenario. Inside of Azure, we're talking more about when you move things to that side of the cloud, how do I do my virtual machines? What is running out there? There's a lot of overlap with the on-premises hybrid components as well. And then we also have the Azure Active Directory piece, which we're going to spend some time today looking at these different services and features here around that directory, because that's the gateway. That's the front door into this Microsoft world, and it all goes through there. And there's a lot of things that are built into there as far as your access and session controls. And over there, all the way on the right, we have some other security controls that get layered into different services. So with your mail, you have your built-in online protection, and you also have a defender for Office 365, which adds more capabilities into that, DLP and so forth. And we're going to talk about a few sections in here. We're going to get into Intune and how that works, Configuration Manager, and we'll touch a little bit on the Defender products as we go through here. So the big one, start up with Azure Active Directory. And, again, this is the core service. This is where all of your users will exist. This is where we will grant controls, grant access, and control what's happening and how people get into the services that are deployed here. And right off the bat, I think it's important, if you're not aware, that even though it shares the name Active Directory, as it is when you buy Microsoft 365 or you just spin up Microsoft Azure, it is not going to work just like Active Directory on your domain controller. So there is a service you can enable that makes it work more like that. But no, out of the box by default with these cloud services, it's not a one-to-one type of relationship, but its core function is the same as your Active Directory on premises. It's to control access to resources. So a few areas that we're going to go into here is it's certainly not all of the features and functions available. Azure Active Directory is a big service and a lot of things going in here, but these are kind of the big ones. So the first one, we talk about single sign-on. So previously, before these cloud services existed, we would have to run federation servers, locally. For Microsoft, that was ADFS, but you might have ran Quest tools or some other tools that actually brought everything together, would translate different credential types and pass them around the network. Usually those were not only expensive to run, they were very complex and they were error prone. Now with the cloud and all the startups and SaaS, so our software as a service deployments that are out there, most orgs have settled on a standard for how this is done, and it's called SAML. So with that, we can actually use Azure Active Directory as our central directory. And by default, all of your Microsoft Office 365 services are going to rely on Azure Active Directory and that integration. If you use Azure in the admin portal, it's going to rely on this as well. But now if I have Salesforce or Google, WebEx, any of these other third-party products, these all support that standard with SAML, and we can plug those in behind here as well and drive all of our authentication through Azure Active Directory. Now, that allows us to put controls in place on who can access what and how, as well as giving a unified view of who's accessing these resources, right? So typically, if they're not and they're disconnected, we have all these cloud services. I have to go to every single one and find, well, who logged on here? Who did this? Where's my audit log on there? And that's still needed in some cases, if you're auditing some type of event. But really, you can get all of that in one view and just know that, Joe logged in, he accessed Outlook, then he went and accessed, Cisco and things like that. And you can get that all through one view. You can also disable that from here, right? So if it's all in here when we're enabling it, it's very easy to offboard somebody, and we can have our automated process that even make it easier. But essentially, we're going to block access. You can no longer log in. We can invalidate your tokens. There's a little more work up front, but to complement single sign-on is you can, depending on your application and what it supports, also do some onboarding and offboarding directly through Azure AD. So for instance, a new hire comes in, we put them in Azure AD. The first time they sign on, for instance, perhaps it provisions that person out in like Salesforce. And there's different versions of this. There's what we call the on-demand provisioning, which is tied kind of into SAML. Essentially, that means the app trusts whoever we send from our environment. It will create their access for them and they're good to go. And there's also the scheduled interfaces as well for provisioning. Essentially, a timer job runs behind the scenes and there's built-in APIs that already work for it, and it says, okay, these users are new, put them over here for access, or this user is disabled, he's now disabled over in this other application. So that's teetering off a little bit because it's not all done in Azure AD. It's very dependent on what the application supports, but definitely ways to use that here, and then you can extend that out. Like we talked about Automate and Logic apps before, there are ways that we can use those also to integrate with APIs if like a provisioning platform is not supported, from the app itself. Again, centralized app management's a benefit here. So we got the portals, we got our dashboards. Users can go in and see all the apps from Office 365. Excuse me. You can add that into the same menu where they access, Word, SharePoint, Teams. You can also use the Azure Launchpad. So there's basically a page that shows all your apps, and they can log in and access it from there. And we talked a bit about reporting already. So multi-factor authentication is also built into the platform. And multi-factor authentication is essentially, an out-of-band method to prove who you are. So the Microsoft app that's you can get on your phone is one method of doing that, and there's different ways that you can implement this. So one is push notification, right? So I go to access the app, I prove who I am, username, password. It then sends a notification, say, hey, somebody's trying to log on. Can you hit this button? You hit this button on your mobile phone. It's out of band that sends a signal back, and then you get in. There's also the standard rotating codes. So outside of that, I can enter my code that rotates on the app. Oh, excuse me. Rotates on the app, and that's another method of access. SMS codes as well are still a thing, and that's still out there, and you can utilize that for your second factor attempt. Now, MFA also integrates with Windows 10 as well. So if you're aware with Windows 10, Windows 10 Hello, that can be unified in kind of your whole deployment experience there and work as an MFA device. So very powerful, and we know really for the most part when you have roaming users and users accessing services, there's two really big things that essentially get you like well over 99% of the way covered from a lot of the scripted bulk anti or malware and active invasion attempts, and that's enabling multi-factor authentication and making sure your apps and your operating system are deployed. Those two big things really close the door on a lot of things that are out in the wild currently. Conditional access. So this is a big one. So as you can imagine with our other scenarios, we have single sign-on, we have our MFA, but we might want to control certain conditions on how you access things. So I might have a single sign-on app that maybe it's just a help desk or a knowledge base that, yes, I want to track you getting into it, but I'm not worried about your MFA, somebody getting into that, with your read-only access. So I might want to create a condition that says when I log on, if I'm getting into that application, I'm not going to trigger that second factor request. But if I access anything else, I'm going to trigger that. Or perhaps I know that I'm coming from a trusted device. It's a user I know on a device I own and I manage. It's compliant. It's inside of my network, which I also have control of. So when all of those conditions are true, we're not going to trigger you for that MFA request. I can add those in there. I can insert like terms of use as well. So externally, let's say I create a rule for people outside of my org. These are called guest users. I could create a flow. Then when you access it as a guest user, I have a terms of service pop up. Maybe, essentially you load like a PDF copy in there. It displays it to them. They have to click a button that says, yes, I accept it. That does sit in a report there. It can be audited, that you can go back and you can see when it was on there, and you can actually trigger those to happen at certain intervals, maybe every 90 days or something. They have to refresh it, and you can add that in there. That's a condition that's in there as well. As you get into more advanced scenarios and some of the more advanced licensing available to you, you can do risk-based conditional access. So that's another big one. So for instance, I log in or someone else is attempting to log in, and the risk signals are saying this is a high risk event. It's coming from a known malicious area and other signals of who the user is or how it's interacting with the service. We could then say force a password change, as well as revoking tokens and maybe then doing an MFA prompt and things like that. So these are all things we can do in conditional access. And before I move on, I'm going to tell you one big scenario is a lot of times we get in and people may not know where to start with it. And so we also help with that. And we have kind of what we consider most people are looking for out of the box available, as long as you have Azure AD conditional access, which comes with an Azure AD premium SKU. And that's internally, if I'm on a managed machine or it's domain joined, I want you to have full access. You can open an Office app, you can download it, you can sync OneDrive, all those things we talked about earlier in the first session. That's fine. But if I go home and I'm on a machine, I don't know who you are. Not that I don't know who you are. We'll prove who you are, but I don't know where that machine is. I don't know what you're going to do with the data, and I don't want you to download the data machine. We can create another rule that works with SharePoint Exchange that restricts you to a browser. So if I try to sync OneDrive, it's not going to work. But if I go to the web, I can still get to OneDrive. Which it's not going to let me download anything, but I can use all the online versions for Word, for instance, and I can still work, but I can keep it off of that machine, so I can still control that access. So it's very powerful. Self-service password management. This is also another one, along with conditional access. The self-service password management is another big reason people opt up. So if you have like the Office 365 E3, which is generally all the collaboration tools, you don't out of the box get access to the Azure AD P1 SKU, which is their premium service that allows for conditional access and the self-service password management with the right back to your local domain controllers. So what that means is traditionally, if I don't have it, I have to have my machine on the network, Control-Delete, reset it, have it go to the main controller, right? Then that will go up to the cloud. If I'm outside of that and I just go to the cloud, it's not going to let me do it. It's going to say contact your admin. You have to go back and do that, right? But this allows that to flow through. This will open up the interface through Office 365, which you can set rules. For instance, you can say, hey, in order to reset your password, you have to prove who you are. So you have to pass, maybe multiple MFA checks. So maybe I'm gonna have them do an SMS code and enter the push notifications and answer security questions. You can create multiple gates there for them to prove who they are, so they can reset their password remotely. It will go down and update the main controllers, so everything else also updates. Which is especially important if they're off network and use something like a VPN as well that relies on that password. And if we look at the next step up, if your machine is actually authenticating against Azure AD, so that means instead of being like domain join locally for a domain controller where you have to be on the network, if it's actually doing this to the Azure AD side of things, you can actually reset your device password as well, and it keeps that all in sync, all in line, which really can help in reducing those help desk requests around password resets.
Hey Zeus, we had a question that I thought it might be good to expand upon. I answered it in the chat, but is it possible to use Intune on iOS devices? The simple answer is yes, but Jesus, would you do you want to expand on things like Apple Business Manager and some of the different capabilities and kind of what the nuanced answer to that is?
We will, but I would say let's hold on to that one because we've got a section on Intune and we'll dive into that.
Sounds great.
Okay, Azure Active Directory, back to that again. When we talk about role-based access, you can assign different levels of access into your directory, and by extension, the things that we do inside of Azure and some of those service applications as well. So, this is carrying forward a best practice that we've had before. Locally, only give people access to what they need, and we can define that here inside of the directory with some default roles. If you needed some customization there, you can actually build roles as well. We generally don't recommend that because it's very rare that you're going to have a use case where you need to. There's so many default roles that Microsoft has in there. But you can also tie this to your conditional access as well. So whereas if I'm a global administrator, that's full access into my directory and my apps. Like that's like a domain administrator. I might want to restrict where that happens. So if I can set a rule in my conditional access, if I come in and it's a global administrator account, I'm only going to let you in if you're on a machine that I know it's trusted and you come from this network, right? So if I go home and try to do it, I can't do it. That limits exposure as far as devices getting compromised or somebody, getting in that account outside of the organization. So, the role-based access by itself is powerful, but then you again combine that with conditional access and it's even more powerful. And if we move up from that, typically you have an account and it has those roles assigned permanently. Well, privileged identity management is a way around that. So instead of just assigning the user the role, what you do is you assign eligibility for a role. So I might have an account that I log in and I'm eligible to be a global admin. By default, I log in, I don't have those rights, but I can go in into Azure Active Directory and then I can request those rights. And then what it does is it audits that request in there. Why do I need access? I can limit it. I can set a default, like it's only going to be active for 2 hours and it's going to give me that right to do work and then it's going to take them away. I can also set approval flows. So, internally, I might have it automatically. So my internal admins just go in, log what you're using it for, and you're going to automatically get escalated. And once you do that, you click a button, it runs through, assigns your permissions, page refresh, and then you have it. You can go do your work. But if I'm let's say a guest or a contractor, for instance, and I want to control that access and I want explicit approval, I can make an approval step in there as well. So I can make somebody actually physically go in and say, yes, this person can get this access, and then click a button, and then it will apply those permissions and run through. And this is all auditable, by the way, too. When you go back in, you can go in and see when the person requested access and how long was it active, and you can see if somebody approved it and what they were doing in there, right? So that's all logged in there as this as part of this service and this function. There's another one too that's actually pretty nice, and that's that you can actually get alerts for when somebody bypasses it. So, for instance, as a global admin, I can temporarily get that access for that 2-hour window, but now I have rights to change permissions. So I could actually go in and assign myself permanent rights. So if I did that, I could actually set up an alert as well that says, hey, so-and-so set this up as their permanent access rights. You may want to go review that, make sure is that valid, or if they shouldn't be doing that, then you educate your admins and remove that again.
So we've got another question, Jesus. If a user of a domain joined computer reset the password without being connected to the on-premises network, does it automatically update the local computer with the new password set by the user?
It will not from a traditional domain-based machine. If you run through that scenario, you still have your local cache credential on the machine that doesn't get updated because it's not talking to the domain controller. However, all of their service passwords are updated, right? So that they would still log on with the new password. So in the event their password expired or they forgot it, they could still work there. Now, if they forgot their password and they can't get on their machine, that's a different story. But they would have that disjointed type of experience. That's where the Azure AD joined is that's what it's called, where you're authenticating to the cloud comes into play, because when you do that, that gives you that unified experience.
Yeah, so the short answer there is it would get updated once it reestablishes communication with the domain controller, i.e. on network connected to a VPN, something like that, to get that. But since the domain controller is the source of authority there, the domain controller would get updated, obviously, because of Azure AD Connect synchronizing passwords if you have two-way synchronization and things like that. So everything on the domain controller, everything in the cloud would get updated, but that local computer isn't reaching out to Azure AD for its updates. It's reaching out to the domain controller. So until that communication is reestablished, it would not become in sync with the rest. So that's one of the benefits of obviously moving towards the cloud, the domain joined machines, is that you can reduce or eliminate dependency on VPNs, as well as reduce or eliminate security gaps of machines that are joined to the network, then sent to the user, and rarely or never come back.
Right. Yep. And there are some advanced scenarios you can do in there with at-paste VPN and specific requests for like maybe only that scenario that could work to tighten up your VPN access. Those are definitely much more advanced and complex rollouts. We don't see many people opt into that. Most people, like, once we actually look at the architecture and we go through what's required, a lot of times people are like, no, we're going to look at maybe that Azure AD joined path, or we've been dealing with this scenario for forever, so it's not that horrible. But do know there are options if you want to explore that. Okay, a couple more here we're going to go through with Azure AD and access reviews. I want to touch on that because when you think about like how many times we get added to a group on a domain controller, domain admins, or even a privileged group, somebody moves, they change roles, never gets in, it doesn't get cleaned up. We kind of forget that this access reviews is there kind of to fix that. You can trigger access reviews for different groups that are in there, for different group memberships, so global admin roles. So for instance, you might have PIM enabled, and then you also have a set of permanent folks that are in there for whatever, maybe they just operate on a day-to-day basis in the service. You can trigger rolling reviews on that. So every 7 days, for instance, evaluate all these people need these rights. You will say yes or no. It's kind of automated through email. If you say no, they're automatically removed. You say yes, they're renewed. And we can also do this with other group memberships. It doesn't have to be the privileged roles. It can be any type of group, to be quite honest. And you have different ways of approving this. You can have someone that's responsible for that, and they have to say approve or reject. But you can also have self-service responsibility. So you might have let's say a Microsoft team, for instance, somebody spins up for a short-term project and you have an access review on that, that will come open and users themselves can say, yes, I'm part of that group or not. And if they say no, it removes them from the group and it kind of keeps that cleaned up. And then behind that, you can also set the default behavior. You can say default behavior, leave them as they are, or default behavior, remove them. So some power there. Same thing with like here I've got access to applications. We talked about single sign-on. You can put those in groups. You can use your conditional access rules, and you can manage access with that and have those reviews kick off. So it kind of gives you that built-in audit process that sometimes gets lost, with all the various groups and access that people have. Azure AD identity protection. So this, when we talk about PIM, we've talked about access reviews, the larger identity protection. The full functionalities are on these Azure AD P2 SKUs, so it's the higher end premium SKUs that they have here. But Azure Identity Protection actually splits this into two. So if you have Azure AD P1, you basically get all of the reporting functionality that's in here, things like risky events, users that are at risk or may not have enabled MFA. You can come in here, you can get reports on that, and then you can manually take action on that. If you want to build in automation into this and draft these up with, not draft these up, integrate them with conditional access, that requires the P2 in there. And what that means is when I have a risky event, I can set a profile. I can classify some of these events as like low, medium, high. I can use conditional access then to trigger things that kick off. So for low, I just might re-trigger an MFA attempt. Medium, perhaps I do that as well, or potentially send, like an email. I can build something off that. Or block access. And then for high, I could maybe block access and force a password reset. So we can add in those workflows automatically here with that identity protection SKUs there. Connect Health is part of a platform too when you think about identity. So we've got the cloud's taken care of, but if you're integrating your domain controllers, you might have some other agents for the different authentication options that we have, like seamless sign-on, pass-through that require local agents, or a federation server like ADFS. So Connect Health here, Mitch, you put these agents out there and it reports on the status all in one dashboard so you can see what it is. It's going to tell you domain replication health, the health of the servers, the certificates on ADFS, if there's any agents that are failing, and it's all there centralized in a dashboard. Just know it's not something that's there by default. You actually have to turn it on. You have to deploy agents and set that up to get that in there. But being how important identity is, that is a pretty important piece. And this one here, Defender for Identity, this is an add-on. So the Defender products, there's a line of products. You actually have Defender for Office 365, which adds in like threat protection as far as like link rewriting, time-of-click checks, detonation chambers when you get things in, and more advanced phishing controls that you can put in rules, right? That applies to that side of things. And I guess I used email, but Defender for Office 365, some of that does go into OneDrive and Teams as well. So for like link checks and so forth. Defender for Identity is built around Azure AD, and it's meant for those hybrid scenarios as well. So we have the health part of it that connects on, it tells us how well things are operating. But if we have Defender for Identity, it starts to integrate things like the behavior analysis and the reports and evaluations that are already happening on the cloud side of things with your domain controllers. Essentially, these are agents you deploy in your domain controllers. It pushes that data up to Azure Active Directory, where it's then evaluated, and it can then see what's going on. It can detect things like lateral movement. It can detect the things that are happening, like when a user's logging into things that normally they wouldn't. So example, I'm an Exchange admin. I log on to Exchange because I've got like maybe a hybrid server there every day. It says, okay, you're logging on to this server. You're managing it every day. I do that for 6 months, and on that 7th month, all of a sudden I'm logging into some other server, and it's going to detect that through the AD logs and send that up, and it's going to say that could be a bit of an anomaly. Like, why is that person all of a sudden working over here? Or, if I'm always on just a handful of servers and then all of a sudden I'm like 30 servers, it's going to flag that because you might have like some type of compromise event going on and lateral movement, and that brings that all into the cloud where you can interface with that. And lastly, I'm going to start, we talked about a lot on how these can be configured, and there's different application things like SSO. And if you're not sure where to start, if you're not already following a framework and you're like, man, what should I start putting in place? Secure Score is a good place to start. you will have this in your Microsoft 365 platform, which it's a wider view. It's going to have Azure AD as well as like some items in Exchange and other things. But there's also one in Azure AD that's targeted just at your identity scenarios. So when you go through that, there's a lot that's happening in here. It's giving you a comparison score. It's kind of using some gamification here, and it's going to show you maybe comparative industries, other tenants that are about the same size based on user licensing and so forth, just as like a benchmark. But the most important thing is kind of the listed activities. So it's going to go in. It's going to say, hey, you should enable MFA for all your users. That's important. It's going to say maybe don't have 20 or 30 global administrators assigned. Bring that back down. You probably want about 5 and just add people as needed. It's going to start you there with those common practices that you can roll out from. And it does try to do a pretty good job of telling you like which ones are more complex to turn on and which ones are going to have the higher friction points for your users. I mostly agree with where those are now. Sometimes there's considerations when you're rolling that out, but again, if you don't have anything today, that's a good place to start and working from there. Okay, so shifting from identity, we're going to talk a little bit about the modern endpoint management and how that works with Microsoft, right? And again, Azure AD is important here because all of our information is there, all of our device information, all of our identities, our controls, and our access policies, and it works with these other tools as well. So that doesn't go away. It's a complement to the service involved, and you're never going to get the full benefit without having that there along with these tools that we're about to talk about. Like I wouldn't go out and just buy Intune and compare that to a MAS 360 or AirWatch on its own. You have to compare it with Azure AD and the other services that are combined around there because they split up the different functionalities. So what Microsoft is moving towards, and they're doing a pretty good job, and really not just Microsoft, but most endpoint management companies now, they're looking for that anywhere, anytime provisioning. So what that means is that's new laptops, new stand-up, new desktop things, right? I want to be able to turn those things on and be ready to go. Deploying apps, regardless where I am. I don't want it to have to sit on an IT admin's desk where they're manually install the apps, or it has to be on the network. We want to be able to get those apps out wherever anybody is. And on those devices that are out there, we have to be able to control those and configure them. We're going to set up configurations on what we allow on that device, what we restrict on that device, what are the security policies out there, and we need to be able to audit that, regardless of where it is. We don't want it to be offline for 30 days like we do now with traditional deployments. And then, that access control that's going back into Azure Active Directory. We want to be able to control access to our services, again, no matter where the user is and where that device is. So that brings us down into what Microsoft has branded their Endpoint Manager or Endpoint Management Suite. That's really a combination of a couple of tools that they have, and that's what I'm showing here. So not that long ago, these were two very separate products, right? System Center Configuration Manager has been the Microsoft configuration go-to tool for a number of years, and it still has a valid scenario here. And then when they started rolling out Intune for managing mobile devices, and it started out just like Android, iOS, Windows Phone. Yep, back in the day it managed that, and then it evolved into more of the modern desktop management, right? Windows 10 started building in the MDM. Actually, Windows 8.1 started it, but Windows 10 has a fully fledged kind of MDM broker that you can use to manage it over these MDM tools. Mac OS started layering that in as well. So now we have a broader range of systems that we can actually manage from Intune, from these cloud MDM services that are just available over kind of the open internet, right? Whereas System Center Configuration Manager will take care of things inside of the network still. And if you have SCCM today, there is a path to integrate Intune, and that can be as a path going to cloud-only management, or it just might be part of maybe a larger strategy where it's going to stay in place and serve some other functions there. So Intune, again, we talked about this, a cloud service. You get Intune, you have your Microsoft 365 service out there. You don't deploy anything locally to make this work. So it is a mobile device management platform, right? So that means we can enroll and fully manage a device. So we can go in and get full ownership of an iOS device. We might do that with Windows 10. And because we have that, now we can do things like push out configurations with it. We can run scripts. We can push out apps to the device. We have security policies that people must opt into and apply on that device, and no matter where it is, right? We also have a version of this just for application management. Now, this is very specific to iOS and Android, whereas I have Microsoft Outlook, Microsoft OneDrive, and I can put rules on the application. This is something of a unique thing that Intune can do. Microsoft doesn't open those APIs for like AirWatch or Maz 360 from that perspective, but we can essentially silo data on there. So the MDM portion, we fully manage it. That's like the traditional method. You can think GPOs and how we do it on the domain controller now. We can do that in the cloud here with desktop devices and even the mobile devices, fully on those devices. But let's say we have those BYOD scenarios, especially around iOS or Android. The mobile application management comes into play here because we get full control over the applications, and that happens at sign-in, right? So we sign into Azure Active Directory, which controls the access, and that triggers that application as well to look at Intune on the policies I've set. And I can do things like force encryption of data only on the application level. I don't have to own the entire device. I can also restrict where that data goes. I can allow data in, but not let it out. So it's very powerful and very common to use these two together. So Intune by itself is really end user devices. And I say this because basically there's no server support here. Microsoft doesn't support their Windows servers, Linux servers, and those type of things are not supported currently with Intune. So you can see here Windows AP1, limited support in what that one can do, but Windows 10, you have full support in what you can do with Windows 10, onboarding it with MDM. Mac OS, that is supported. A lot of advanced scenarios now are enabled in that. That was limited for a long time, but we can now push out configuration scripts to Mac OS. We can run scripts with Mac OS, push out, Apple Store, things like that. Android, same thing in iOS. Now, Windows Phone, I left that off. Technically, that's still supported with Intune, but Windows Phone itself is not supported. You'll also notice there's a big thing missing here, and that's Chromebooks. So Chromebooks currently aren't supported. I can't tell you why that is, if it's a Google, Microsoft thing or not, but you can't manage Chromebooks through Intune. You would have to actually have that through the Google management platform. But speaking of those management platforms, you should know that I can use Intune without being integrated with Android Enterprise or Apple Business Manager. I can have what's called a user enrolled experience. And essentially what that means is I had the device, I'm going to opt into enrollment, and then the device can be managed from that standpoint. But we can take that farther. If you have Apple Business Manager, you have devices loaded, you can integrate those functions as well. So you can set up almost a zero-touch experience with iOS and for onboarding from that experience, because basically the new device turns on, it always talks to Apple Business Manager first. It's going to know that Intune is set up as your MDM server, and it can enroll the device through that function. There are some hoops to jump through with Apple Business Manager. If you don't already have it, you basically have to have like a Dun & Bradstreet number, so you'd have to go get that, enroll that, prove who you are, sign up for an organization account, and your devices would have to be enrolled. If you don't work with someone that would enroll that for you, so if you buy something directly from AT&T, they can dump it in there. That's fine. That's awesome. But if not, you have to go through that process of adding devices into Apple Business Manager. And the only way to do that is from a Mac. You have to have the Mac configurator there, plug your devices in. You can then use that configurator to onboard them into ABM. So it's a very manual process for like existing devices if they're not in there. And you have to kind of weigh whether or not that's worth going through that process versus having kind of the user-based enrollment access there. And it's more than just that. There's different things you can do with the device depending on that user enrollment versus the ABM enrollment. Android Enterprise, kind of the same thing. If you have somebody that works, can load it into Android Enterprise for you. You bought them for Verizon, it's going to drop in there. But if you just buy them off retail, they're not going to be in there. And oddly enough, where Google's usually a little more open than Apple, this one is actually closed off, because if that device is not already in Android Enterprise, there's not a way to add one in after the fact. So you don't get that option. Windows 10 has a very similar function with Intune, and it's what they call autopilot, which I'm actually going to talk a little bit more into there. But essentially, it's the same thing. A device manufacturer can preload those devices into the portal for you. It's recognized as a corporate device when somebody turns it on, and it goes through its onboarding experience. Like Apple, if that is not the case, you can there's scripts you can run to pull that data off and then preload them into the portal. So there is a method to get around that. So the other side of this, we have the configuration manager. So configuration manager still has a use case here because it fills in the gap that Intune had before at minimum, like if you want to manage servers through this platform, right? So that could be used for that. Now, if you already have SCCM as well, you can start enabling something that's called co-management, which essentially lets you take a device that's managed with SCCM and have that enroll into Intune. And then you can actually decide who's going to be responsible for what. So there's essentially selections that you can do. So for instance, I might want to move my update management to Intune. I would just move this slider. Intune would take over management of that portion of it. SCCM would still manage the rest of that. Same thing with app deployments, configuration items that we push out. There's like 5 or 6 sliders that you can control from that where they're both on the machine. Now, when you're in this mode, traditionally, if SCCM is out there, right, you have to talk to the device. You need line of sight, and most of the time that means being on the network. And most deployments will require a VPN for that to work. And yes, there are some ways you can put things out in the DMZ and set up your SCCM that way. Those are pretty complex and a bit error prone, to be honest. And there's a lot of PKI stuff that you have to set up as well to support that. So to get around that, if you wanted to extend SCCM out, and not you, because you're not going to Intune, but you need to have this in between, you can deploy what's called a cloud management gateway, which essentially is an Azure service, and it spins up an SCCM management instance in Azure, and you can also have deployment points there, right, for files and apps that sit out there. And now when a user's off network, they can still talk to SCCM, they can still report back, you can still push things out to them as well. And it does help for onboarding too, because you can actually use that. You can use Intune as part of an experience that kind of pulls down the SCCM client and integrates them in this co-management experience. And that would be something you would do, if you don't want to have just a subset all managed by Intune and a subset in co-management, for instance, you might want them all onboarded with the same profile. So you could use that scenario there. Okay, autopilot. This is the big one, right? So a lot of folks kind of understood you could do the different MDM functions with iOS and Android. You sign in, that scenario I said, it talks to Apple Business Manager, onboards your MDM. There's not anything else for the user to do. It's all configured. Apps get pushed out to it. This exists now for Windows 10 as well, and that's called autopilot. And there's different grades of it, from like light touch to zero touch. But you don't have to deploy like separate images, right? So SCCM, for instance, I might have a Windows image, and then I might deploy my apps on top of that, or maybe I bake my apps into the image, and that's like the traditional way we would do it. Well, Windows 10 essentially has its place now where it can wipe itself, and it keeps the default Windows image. So we can restart it, and it's just the Windows OS on its own, and we don't have to deploy that image. That's the base image. It exists on every Windows 10 device now today. And we can also go through and have it run through the onboarding. So when I set up my device out of the box, I'm going to put in my username and password, right? It's going to ask me, do I have a work account or not? Now, there's 2 forks that it takes. This is if I'm not setting up my corporate identifiers, but I am going to use my corporate credentials. When I put them in, it's going to take you out to the cloud. It's going to look and it's going to say, okay, I'm going to join you up to Azure AD. And then we're going to have that cloud connected experience, the password resets and all those things that we talked about before. It's then going to notice that, hey, I have an Intune profile that you're required to have. It's going to pull that down and start setting up the device, configuring that device for first time use. If there's applications that I've published, those applications are going to start to be pushed down onto that device and then installed. And it's really ready to go after that, right? I mean, I'm simplifying it, and there's some time that happens in between all this happening, but it happens no matter where I am, because if this is all published out on those cloud accessible endpoints, I can do it from home, I can do it from the office, as long as I have internet connectivity, that's going to happen. So if we move back to the beginning of that experience now, if I have pre-set up a device, so if I have it set up in autopilot, I have the identifiers in my portal, it's already been loaded. When I turn on that device, the first thing you do is you sign up for Wi-Fi wherever you are, your internet, or plug it in. You're going to get on the network, and it's going to go out and talk to Microsoft. It's going to send a ping out, and it's going to say, I know what this device is. It's tied to this organization. And then it's going to pull up a screen that restricts them on what they can do. So the previous example, I could use a work account or a personal account. In this example, I can only use a work account. And then I'm going to put that work account in, and it's going to go out and pull my profile down. Now, the big difference here too is I have options. So with that SCCM scenario, perhaps I still want this machine to be domain joined, and I want that SCCM client. I can build that into my autopilot profile. So I don't only have to do cloud joined scenarios here. I can do domain joined scenarios through the autopilot program. So once your device is out there, and it's enrolled and it's in Intune, or you have SCCM, of course, you then have remote actions that you can take. I mean, at this point, I can remotely request to wipe a device. I can reset a device. There's actually an autopilot reset function now, which does exactly what we just talked about. If I click that, it's going to start the device over. It's going to be like a new device, and I have to reset it up, re-download it, and get things going, which can be handy if somebody's remote, they're at home, you can't get into it, you can't fix it for whatever reason. At some point, it's too costly to do that. You're just going to traditionally re-image that machine, and here we can do that directly from the console remotely and get them going again. So yes,
we have a question. Does the raw Windows image on all Windows 10 machines get updated with Microsoft provided Windows 10 updates when they are applied to the PC, or do all of those updates get applied to quote unquote catch up after the device is wiped?
So yes and no, right? As Windows is updated, some of the point releases, security releases do have to be applied. But like, the feature updates that come out, that's built into the image. That's kind of the reset of where the image is. For the most part, from what I've seen, is there's not a lot of catch up that's required. So I guess it's better to say there's checkpoints, right? So depending on where you are in that cycle, there may be some updates to catch up. But in my experience, it's not like you're not going to sit there for 4 hours getting updates. It's a small amount of time. Okay, so moving away from autopilot a bit, I am going to talk about like the endpoint protection for these devices. Now, we talked about how we can push apps out wherever they are. So even if you have a third-party product like Semantic or something like that you were installing devices, you could package that up and send that out just like you would do under any other type of packaged application that you go out. Now, Windows 10, of course, has the Defender endpoint protection that is built into it, and while when it first came out, it did not get good marks from the security community in its effectiveness, the present iteration generally scores very well, in the test for catching malware, and that's just kind of the unmanaged piece that's on the desktop. So when you have Defender for endpoint, that marries it with a centralized configuration console, as well as giving you the ability to take action on your device. So it's not just the anti-malware engine that you're getting there. You're enabling it to work with some remediation actions. It does tie into a lot of the other security services that are out there. We can push other things out. So if we detect an exploit in one endpoint, you can actually have a rule that goes out and then sets different configurations or protection mechanisms on your other endpoints as those are detected and come in. And we can also then integrate it with like local DLP and sensitivity labels. We didn't spend much time, we didn't spend any time today actually talking about how we protect documents and those type of things. In the cloud, we have options for that. It's very easy. I store it to SharePoint, I can tag it and the document is protected. But if I'm local and I create something locally, it doesn't get tagged yet until I have it in the cloud or I manually put the tag on there. Whereas Defender with endpoint, I can run that. I can have my DLP engine that's checking those local documents as well and have those tags as part of that response. So it's not just anti-malware. It's a very deep tool, and there's a lot that you can do in it. If you have if you're large enough and you have not IT folks, but security folks or an operations center there's a lot of hunting capabilities and things that are built into the platform. And as well as you're getting advantage of what a lot of these EDR platforms are. Which EDR, by the way, it's endpoint detection and response. If you've heard that, and they all basically are collecting all these signals from not just you, but everybody else that's running it as well, along with all the other security products. So they're getting a really wide view of things that are happening in the environment, and they're able to tune a lot of the rules inside of these tools for us to catch those things. And
Hey,
the other,
yes. Sorry to interrupt you. I didn't want to get too far away from the previous conversation because more questions coming in on that one. What about rollbacks? What if you had to perform a rollback?
A rollback, as in like off a service pack or something?
Yeah, updates and things like that.
Well, being that the base image is caught up with it, I guess it would determine on what the rollback's for. That would be a specific scenario. I mean, you can't roll back to a previous instance per se directly from the console. And I haven't tried it because I haven't really had a need for it. But if you've applied a feature update, that stays with Windows 10 unless you've removed it or you've set rules to remove it after a certain period. So I would imagine that we could probably script something to work from that standpoint. I have yet to encounter an area where we had to do a full rollback on the OS, whereas you would just do a new install at worst and then build your apps on top of that.
Right, or you'd certainly remove certain feature packs. I mean, as long as it's not bundled into like a cumulative type thing into a bundle and stuff like that. So it really depends on the nature of what is trying to be carved out would be my answer, right? Is it something that can be rolled back individually, or is it part of like a baseline that needs a different approach to re-imaging the device at a certain level and then identifying, what went wrong?
Right, and it's worth pointing out as well is essentially we can package up PowerShell scripts and run those out on the device. So if there's something that's not in the interface itself, if it has the ability to be scripted out, you can do that. So you can essentially, if anything in the tool set doesn't fit your needs and you have a small gap, you can always fall back to that, build those scripts out, package them up, and send them out. And there's actually multiple ways you can send those scripts out and manage that as well. Okay, awesome. So back to Defender real quick. The only last point I want to make on this slide is if over on the left, you'll see the support here. When this first came out, it was tied to Windows 10 only, which honestly limited the deployment, right? Because most people don't have just Windows 10 and they have other environments, and where Semantic and Trend covered everything, it didn't make sense to run two products. And they've since expanded that out. So Windows 10 now, you have it, it's built in, you can run it, of course, but there is one agent that works on Mac OS, Linux actually as well for those service products. Android is out there, and iOS, I believe, just came out of that beta phase where you can also deploy it onto those, those MacBooks, or not MacBooks, iPads, and those type of things. The other note, I do have a line in there where it says Microsoft servers via Azure Defender. So that's still the Defender for Endpoint product. But when you get Azure Defender, which if you're familiar with Azure, it was previously rebranded Security Center. That also gives you the license to run that on the servers as well. And it all still goes into this, the dashboard, and it again integrates with all the different services that are out there, both on the Azure side and the Microsoft 365 side. So this brings me to what I want to hit on a little bit. Is we've talked a lot about different services, and I just want to talk about the big SKU here, the Microsoft 365 E5 package, which essentially has nearly all of these security solutions bundled into it. So when you move up to that E5, you're going to get that Azure AD P2 and Azure Information Protection P2. Though we didn't spend a lot of time on that part, that's protecting documents, labels, encrypting Word documents, and so forth. It's these P2 products. The way I like to differentiate those, and it's simplifying it by quite a bit, but is when we look at Azure AD P1 and Azure Information P1 versus the P2 products, just think about the difference between reporting and manual remediation versus automation. So when I have the P1s, for instance, when we talked about the risky user interface, like I can go in and I can see the reports, and it tells me, right, that this user is listed as potentially an issue because they don't have MFA, but I'm not really doing anything with it. I'm not having a new rule set on that. Or if we see the what do they call it, impossible travel, right? 2 authentication attempts within a short amount of time, but the physical distance is too far apart to be realistic. So we are just alerted on that on the P1 side of things. Azure Information Protection, I have it. I can set up a label, I can watermark it and encrypt a document, but I have to manually do it. I have to maybe prompt the user to open the document and apply it on their own. If I want to automate these things, if I want to add them into conditional access, or I want to go and do a scan of a repository and apply this protection to documents, that's where those P2s come in. So if you think about that, you'll understand kind of the differentiators there between those P1s and P2s. And the Defender suite here, those can all be purchased separately as well. So it's pretty common, especially that Defender for Office 365, to be attached to like an E3 subscription. But Defender for Identity, which we talked about, that hybrid integration there, right? That's another add-on. And then Defender of Endpoint, which we just talked about, those are all included in the E5 suite, but you could go back and of course get those on their own. And here's a big one we really didn't get into, but Microsoft Cloud Access Security. It is what's called a CASB, or a Cloud Access Security Broker. Lots of vendors have these now. And I will tell you, Microsoft's unique place here is it works like a reverse proxy in the cloud in front of Office 365. So some of these products will let you employ agents locally on desktops, and they give you a similar experience, but then the desktops and the agents have to be controlled. Whereas this does so from the cloud, so regardless of device. And why would you want that is I can get more granular control. So I can say, this document has PII, I'm not going to let you download it because you didn't pass this device check. It's also going to let you know alerts that are a little bit more advanced. So for instance, mass download events are actually triggered there. So if I'm in OneDrive and somebody's exfiltrating data, it's going to pick those alerts. I can also tie these into automation behind the scenes. When I detect something, it actually uses logic apps, very much like Power Automate, that drives something, whether it's an alert, an SMS, an action, blocking access, like whatever I can really think of, I can tie that into there. So it by itself could probably warrant hours on conversation into what it adds in there. And again, that's on the E5 side of things. So I know we've been hitting Q&A as we go, and we're right just past 11:30. Are there any other questions, Jason, we want to bring up before I just run to the next slide?
No, I'll let you kind of run through the next slide. Then what we'll do is we'll kind of power on through, and I'll land this plane with the final section. All
right. So yeah, I'm just going to highlight. We've said it a few times. We have these roadmap sessions where we work with you and we develop kind of the recommendation on how to not just configure them, but the order of how you might want to roll them out and introduce them into the environment. And we start that, like as Jason said, it's where you are. Everybody's in a different position from where they're starting their journey. So we try to look at where that is. Do we need to start with the bigger view and get you moving on out and ordering that? Or sometimes it's just a subset of it. Maybe it's just the security pieces, and we build the roadmap around those and how those roll out. So we're very flexible in how we leverage these engagements and working with you and helping you work your way through the deployment of the different services. So at that, Jason, that's my last slide, and I'm going to give it back to you.
Awesome, Jesus. Let me get this shared out. I want to make sure that everybody can see it. Jesus, can you see my screen now?
Yes, I have it up.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Jesus. I know you kind of powered through 2 segments there with a ton of good information, and couldn't have introed my segment other than talking about our workshop a little bit better. The one thing I would double down on that with is a lot of you are here today based on things that maybe eGroup had sent out, but a lot of you are here today based on what your Microsoft team had sent out or past interactions with us. Over my career, I've spent a lot of time in computer science by education, doing software development, things like SharePoint work, working with these tools. I always call myself the most average developer ever. But then I had the opportunity to lead development teams and kind of have something that was like at its peak 88 different line of business applications that were custom developed for a real estate holdings company in my purview, and being able to see all the different things that have been successful, to being able to consult with a lot of organizations and help a lot of organizations with their challenges, everything ranging from SharePoint all the way to data center and networking, and lead eGroup's team of delivery experts across the board in project management. So had a lot of exposure to what makes some of these things successful. But what I do today is probably the thing that I derive the most satisfaction out of, which is I get to hear a lot about customer challenges. Some of your question today, as I can dive into them, and I get to see a lot of them at scale, and I get to see a lot of things, fortunately, that work, and I get to see a lot of things that didn't work, which has helped us hone an approach to helping our clients have success with their goals, which is hopefully focusing less on their IT and more on their clients and what their business is out there to truly succeed with. And with this segment, I want to share a few of those stories. A lot of these had started with whether it's a cloud adoption workshop, an Azure blueprint, or something specific. Maybe it's even a mobile device management proof of concept. I'll kind of give some of those examples, but how some of those stories came about, what we did, along the way, what were some of the challenges, what solutions they ultimately ended up adopting, and what opportunities are there if that's relevant to you to take the next step. But more so than anything, my ask is, if you have questions, we're here, and we like talking to people. We like understanding the stories. We're not big high pressure people. We can work independently. We can work alongside your Microsoft team. So please reach out if you have questions, not just during the event. Join a Teams Tuesday. If you're interested in data center, join the Nutanix at 9 session on Wednesdays. Definitely a lot of opportunities to interact with the eGroup team. So what is meant by successful remote work? And really, remote work is kind of a funny term these days, because it's the same concept whether you're in the building, whether you're outside the building, whether you're out traveling, or whether you're sitting at your kitchen counter doing a webinar like I am today. It's really, how do you be productive where you are? How do we keep our end users productive wherever they need to work to do the best job? And how do we keep them secure and keep our businesses secure with that flexibility and scenario, so that IT can allow users to do what they need to do without a lot of restrictions, but also maintain the security things that have led to those restrictions in the past. So 4 quick examples I'll go through. Again, I won't go through them in depth, but I just want to kind of hit on them. One was a client we worked with over a long period of time, where we kind of termed the saying trading servers for services was one of the things that the client would say all the time. Anytime I can trade a server for service, I feel like I'm doing a good thing, and I feel like I'm moving down towards success, or towards success. So it was good. Another one, how an organization rapidly enabled their call center and support staff to work seamlessly from anywhere. I mean, in definition on rapidly, this was definitely a pandemic-driven response, but how the pandemic had them think differently and shine some lights in their voice DR strategy for what they needed, and how Microsoft solutions and partner solutions were able to help there. Another one was how an organization was able to provide a seamless and secure experience for vendors and their users, but primarily for vendors to access their environment, so that they could ensure security, secure access to their Azure environment, secure access to their modern work environment, without a lot of complexity from vendor to vendor, and having to depend on various what eGroup calls our environmental access protocol. That customer was able to say, like, this is how you interact with us, and secure that across working with many vendors to ensure that vendor risk didn't become their risk. And then the last one, device management and security. We've talked about this quite a bit, but finally, how an organization streamlined their management of devices and maintain compliance in the financial world by allowing end users to do BYOD, corporate-owned assets, enroll things like Apple devices, iOS devices and Apple Business Manager, but also do things like Macs and Android, and really provide flexibility to their end users, but be able to meet some of the more advanced security capabilities. So transitioning to servers to services. The idea about this one was, this organization had a national presence, really international presence, data center in Virginia, but some slight DR capabilities in their headquarters, hosted about 118 servers, give or take, 10 or so there at any point during their life cycle. Had services on 4 different continents in a lot of places and low bandwidth areas and things like that, and developing countries, and really had a challenge in the beginning with aging infrastructure, lack of budget to do things like redundancy. I remember day one of the things we were talking about was they only had one core switch between their server infrastructure and their storage networks, kind of some of those things. A lot of things were on premises. Downtime was common when we were introduced to this client. They actually measured about 6 to sometimes as many as 8, but about 6 on average downtime events per month. And started to measure those and just realized that, IT wasn't a good term within the organization. So new leadership had come in, and it was people we'd worked with in the past, and we laid out the challenge of, how do I get rid of these 118 servers? We only have like 600 users, and only about 100 of those are truly like office workers, right? The rest of them are out in the field and probably don't think a lot about IT other than when it doesn't work for them. So we really have about a server per employee, and that's obviously too many for their goal. Not always for everybody, but too many. So how do we start getting rid of that and getting IT towards a services-driven approach? So we did a workshop, and this extended beyond Microsoft 365, but went into the data center as well, and designed and spent multiple days in their conference room back when we could do things like that, and really built out a roadmap of, okay, this is step 1, this is the end. Everything from the easy answers, which was, hey, we can get rid of 6 to 8 of those servers if we just don't have Exchange on premises. What are these 12 servers associated with a service called Link? Why aren't we using Skype and then Teams and products like that? We have 4 servers around SharePoint services for internal communication. SharePoint Online seems like a great example. We have a ton of file servers on FirstScan. We have malware on these file servers. So how do we get those cleaned up, secure, isolated, and get those to OneDrive? Microsoft 365 was able to eliminate more than half of these servers with just services practically on a single SKU, and was able to do so quickly across that. And then everything that wasn't able to solve with Microsoft 365, some things like the HR platform went to Workday, so it wasn't a dynamic solution. Not everything is always a Microsoft answer, right? I think some of those things happen. And then Dynamics was a coupling in there for a CRM capability that they had, so kind of a split hosted solution there. They decided to go to Meraki for their global networks to kind of streamline some of those. But everything that wasn't able to go in there, they put into Microsoft Azure. And then the mission we had with them was we would go down the list maybe once a quarter and say, justify why this server has to exist. So really, really fun kind of engagement, because we created true digital transformation for them. And it sounds like that's an extremely expensive thing. They spent a good amount of money with us. I mean, a significant amount of money in services and things like that to make it happen. But over a measured 3-year period from start to finish, when they got to kind of 18 servers today, after that, in taking things like downtime from 6 outages per month to 1 outage in the past year, to eliminating to 4 SaaS offerings, 1 PaaS and 1 IaaS, that centrally managed global network, and eliminated phone systems, they were able to save $1.9 million a year in IT costs. And that's inclusive of the money they spent with eGroup, as well as select other vendors that they added to their portfolio to get them there. So it wasn't like it was a huge capital expenditure for a future return. We were able to measure that year over year by consolidating contracts and eliminating downtime and doing all those things. How that spending money and consolidating these services and spending more money on the right solutions while retiring some legacy ones was able to save them dollars. So one of the by far the best stories I've been a part of, and love to kind of dive deep and tell anybody some of the details of that. But from start to finish, a rough situation, 3 years later, and really they had incremental gains. Within 4 months, they had the outages down to like 1 a month, and then they were 1 a quarter. So there was some incremental gains along the way that were allowed them to save them that total ROI. Another one, a lot more simple, right? Organization had multiple offices in multiple states in Europe. They acquiring organizations, that is happening all the time today. How do you bring two Office 365 tenants together? How do you merge teams? If you're ever in that situation, there are a lot of details that you have to figure out, because a lot of the tools and literature and documentation is still focused on how do you go from on-prem to the cloud, but how do you bring two organizations that are already in the cloud together under one umbrella? It doesn't exist as much, but the good news is the tools are rapidly maturing. And if you have questions about that, that's something that we work on daily with organizations, as mergers and acquisitions are really at an all-time high over the last 10 years, over the last year, and things happening along that. So this organization had the challenge of multiple voice solutions, having to bring these things together. One organization was on team. Actually, the acquired organization was ahead of them in Microsoft 365 than they were. So they had to catch up, and then they had to kind of, bring everything together. So what we were able to help them with was the existing organization was new to team. So we were able to bring them up to speed and help them understand what that would look like. The service center was immediately forced remote due to the pandemic, and that's tough with typical service center deployments. And they had a lot of investment in on-prem resources with that service center. So what we were able to do is kind of level set them in the acquired organization within code, like a consolidated Microsoft 365 tenant, establish why teams going forward should be the choice for call center even after a return to office, and how they can go about doing that in their remote stance or their office, and regardless of where the users end up working long term, they can be successful. How can we integrate phone plans so that they can connect to that on-premises resources in the meantime, but also be able to long-term look how to retire on-premises resources for cloud-based voice solutions and things like that. If you were on the meeting on our Teams Tuesday yesterday, you heard a lot about Scipio.io. So Scipio being a carrier service third party that provides dial tone and a lot of the capabilities you need from a routing partner. So how Scipio, Microsoft 365 were able to always funnel all those things from desk phones to conferencing solutions to call center capabilities integrated with their on-premises solution, as well as their cloud hosted voice, and continue that thing to be able to provide them exactly what they need anywhere they are with the phone numbers they need, so that when their service center picks up the phone and calls somebody, basically it's not coming from a random location. It's not coming as a Teams call. It's coming directly as you would if they were picking up the phone inside the service center. And as a side effect, this wasn't necessarily the main motivation for this. We were able to pretty significantly reduce their carrier and distance fees with some of the things that Scipio brings to the table with internal long distance calling. Basically, international calling is a local call within the same tenant. It's only external calling that gets metered as long distance. And then what they do is they use daily competitive rates based on market to be able to provide those services at the lowest cost in the industry. Two more. So quickly here on virtual applications and desktops. So organization with legacy applications and high compliance requirements is ripe for a VDI solution, meaning when we say legacy applications, we mean applications that are core to the business, financial industries, legal industries, healthcare. There's a lot that goes down that. Government has a lot of these where there's applications that are critical to the operation of the business that aren't easily modernized to modern platforms, can't be easily moved to SaaS-based platforms without significant disruption. So those projects are years in the making to kind of replace a full application. But also combined with, and some of the reasons that they are hard to move to modern platforms is because those applications have been vetted, they have the compliance risks met, all of those different things. So this organization had that kind of, double-headed threat, which was we've got aging applications that need infrastructure. We need to be able to provide our end users a way to access these, not necessarily during the pandemic, but anywhere that won't be in the office. And we have to be able to meet compliance requirements. Virtual desktop solutions are perfect for this. So what we did is kind of a subset of our overall Microsoft Azure blueprint, or our modern workplace roadmap. We talked about Windows Virtual Desktop, and used our Windows Virtual Desktop proof of concept engagement funded by Microsoft to help them deploy Microsoft Azure AD Premium, some of that security stuff we were talking about, password resets, and how do you connect the Azure AD directory services, the service that kind of mimics directory domain controller type capabilities within the cloud for Windows Virtual Desktop. We have find a place for those desktops to live. How do we get the Windows entitlements through Microsoft 365, and ultimately provide end users a desktop when they need it, only when they need it, from anywhere, using things like burstable compute, using things like Windows Virtual Desktop images, but Intune management, and kind of the best of two worlds between modern workplace as well as Azure, to be able to allow those desktops anywhere, but be able to put those policies, the auditing, the logging, the compliance, and all of that good stuff on it to be able to secure it. One of the things I like about this too is prepared. I've also done a lot of like Horizon View, a lot of Citrix, and those are great solutions. We work with those day in and day out, every day. You know, how do you, there's a lot of different flavors and a lot of different purposes for VDI. But particularly with WVD and those Azure-based resources that we can do, we were able to get this user, this environment in under a week. So the ability and timeline to, create, design, deploy, and present VDI to the end users in a secure fashion is greatly compressed over what it's taken in the past, which are typically multiple month projects of acquiring infrastructure, configuring infrastructure, testing, doing images, and things along those lines. And last but certainly not least, organization we're working with, and we've been working with over the last year to do a complete overhaul of how they present applications to their end users. Another organization that was forced remote, but like many organizations, are going to stick with remote work for the near term and probably the long term, seeing the benefits of it, and are working to kind of refit their offices to support what is now the new normal. They too have advanced compliance requirements, being in both the insurance and the financial industry, nationwide, kind of recognizable name, those types of things, as well as having the need for vendor access into their environment, particularly, a bunch of third-party vendors that work with them on a lot of different things. They started with the Modern 365 Workplace Roadmap session. We're able to spend some time with them, design kind of what Microsoft 365 E5 capabilities could do to plan, implement, and extend the solutions below. But also was able to maximize the Microsoft investments in both pre-sales and post-sales implementation support based on those licensing upgrades, working alongside with their Microsoft team to ensure that, all the incentive programs, all the best opportunities, funding from Microsoft to not only conduct the workshop, but once we were able to transact the licensing that's based on the plan we created, additional funding to help them get started with the implementation. Was able to get them into the Azure AD Premium P2 space so that they could have the advanced compliance and security capabilities, deployment of Intune along with their current SCCM co-management capabilities, enterprise rollout of Teams, even plugging in different training components, self-service training directly embedded in Teams, knowledge-based type things so that we can enable their users. Got them to Exchange Online. That's typically, and was in this case, step one, the first foray into the cloud, as well as getting their users equipped with OneDrive, so that they could work from anywhere, work from the office, and again do that seamlessly, but meet all those advanced compliance requirements and all the things of conditional access, multi-factor authentication, data loss prevention that Jesus was going through earlier. So I hope that's helpful. And I know it was a large investment of time today to go through. So we're really, really appreciative. And we hope some of you will join Jesus and I again tomorrow as we dive a little bit deeper into the Azure side of the world. But my ask is, again, to contact us. We've talked about our modern workplace roadmap workshop. We do a lot of these, and we're very, very happy to kind of walk you through the process, as well as first step is learn more about your business and learn more about what you need so that we can customize and tailor it to you. But under subsets of that, doing things like modern voice, virtual desktops, individual solutions, whether it's Exchange Online, OneDrive, Teams, SharePoint, Power Automate, all the things we were talking about earlier, and even something we haven't talked as much about, which is popular if you kind of adopting these solutions today, but you're looking for that double check. There are programs available for security assessments to go in and look kind of far and wide at what you're doing today and see if there's opportunities to go from secure enough to really, really secure, and kind of make sure some of those gaps are closed. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining. So we do have some prizes and giveaways. One of the challenges we have with I'll say it like we always go through these with the live events, is that we don't know who's attending until we actually close the live event. So I'll ask one thing: if you're joined as anonymous, please take the time to drop your name and email into the question and answer, and so that we can actually get you in the drawing. If you're joined as anonymous, we have no way of knowing if you were actually here or who you were. But for those that are not joined as anonymous, what Jesus and I will be doing is within the hour, we'll be taking those names, randomly drawing a number, and we'll be reaching out to those people and announcing those winners throughout our marketing stuff so that we can get those prizes to you. So with that, if there aren't any additional questions, Jesus, I'm ready to take some questions if we've got any.
All righty. Hold on.
Looks like we got
second.
one that
Just one. Yep.
maybe from you, Jesus, or maybe for you.
Oh, we do actually, and I missed that one on there. So yeah, so what happens if an end user had the out-of-the-box of an auto device and has not been connected to the internet? Does it pick up the policy and does it get connected? Oh, okay. I think this is going through, like, you have an autopilot scenario. We have the out-of-the-box experience, but the user is not connected to the internet. Well, actually, it can't complete the sequence if they're not completed. And when you go through that experience, generally speaking, with Windows, the first thing it's going to want to do is reach out and get yourself connected, right? So usually that's the first step. If you got Wi-Fi, put in the credentials or plug it in, and then it will go through that. So that is one piece. If it's just out of the box, no configuration applied on it, you get the default that everybody gets, and that user could then skip that, and it would allow them to create a local account. Now, if that happens, they won't get the policy signed in, and the autopilot sequence actually doesn't kick in from there. And that's actually a scenario I don't think we've checked to see what happens after they go to sign in again, especially with a device that's already registered after the fact. So that's an interesting one. I'll have to look into and see how that actually works. But not having that control when you first sign in, there would be the possibility that they could keep a local account.
Awesome. Yeah, that's something. If you want to reach out, definitely connect with us on that one. That's something we can look a little bit more into. Another question that popped up, Jesus, the available for GCC was in regards to the Power Apps. Anything
Yes,
off the top of your head? I know sometimes when it comes to GCC, we have to look at the latest and greatest to understand exactly what the limitations are. But anything off the top of your head?
I know Power Automate is. I believe Power Apps is now. Power Virtual Agents, I don't believe is available out in the GCC. I would definitely have to go double check as far as the integration with the Teams side of that. So
yeah, I was going to take this one. So any recommendation on how to go from a hybrid environment to completely online and what impact that it might have? So, well, Jesus, this one might be better for you. I'm making an assumption when I read this that we're talking about, kind of exchange hybrid environments, or are we talking about, kind of your hybrid environment with Azure AD, and you're looking to kind of reduce the last leg, which would be eliminate domain controllers altogether. So depending on kind of the nuance of that one, Jesus, you want to kind of talk through both of those scenarios at a high level, and then maybe we can take that one and dig a little bit more into details.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as you know, hybrid is essentially when you have any type of on-premises component of your solution that ties into the cloud. So, when you look at it more holistically, if you want to literally get rid of everything on premises, you can certainly do that. We've talked a lot about how that works from like the workstation side of things and how authentication works in there, and that's not as difficult as a lift, right? There's some things to think about from the user perspective on like how do we change profiles from moving from like a domain logon to an Azure AD logon, how do we move how we package content and get that up in the cloud and so forth. And you can walk that one down pretty transparently. The other side of that is when we have the other things that aren't workstations that rely on the authentication. So anything locally, you might have custom applications running on servers, the servers themselves, the service accounts, the printers, other devices that rely on it. Those all have different things you have to take under consideration to actually move to the cloud and even understand if it works for you to go fully into the cloud. And that's, both with M365 and then where does Azure step in to help plug in some of these gaps. That is usually a little more challenging because it does depend on what those servers and applications do and how they use authentication to determine what your options are. So as I kind of alluded to with maybe just like a quick minute before in an earlier presentation, Azure Active Directory on its own doesn't work like a normal directory, right? For like authentication.
This was clarified as sorry to interrupt you, Jesus. This was clarified as Exchange. So when we talk about the hybrid Exchange hybrid role server, do you want to talk about the roadmap or maybe the lack thereof in that case?
Yeah. So supposedly this was a problem Microsoft's been working on for 2 years, but they kind of said, hey, we know it's a problem. We're going to come back and figure something out. It's been 2 years and they have literally said nothing else on it. So as of right now, the purpose of that Exchange server, really it's twofold, but one from the requirement standpoint, the requirement is built in from a supportability in that deployment. So if you have an environment that's like dir synced, right? So you're running your AD accounts locally, they sync up to the cloud. So Exchange comes into play there because Exchange updates the schema of your local Active Directory. And per Microsoft's terms of use, the only tools allowed to modify those attributes come from the tools inside of Exchange. So you have to use the the Exchange web console or the PowerShell commands that are packaged with that server. So that being said, from a technical standpoint, you actually don't need Exchange, right? We have AD PowerShell, we have other tools that work and can update those attributes and still sync those up and keep them in there. You're just not going to be in a place that's actually supported by Microsoft technically in that case. Now, the other side of that, usually where Exchange fits in, is when we talk about relaying from printers and apps and scanners and so forth. So technically, you can point those directly up at the cloud. I usually recommend you don't do that because a lot of these devices, they don't have retry capabilities, right? I put something in a printer scanner, it runs through, it sends the email out. If it fails, it just fails. It doesn't go out. It doesn't necessarily sit in a queue and retry it. Now, so if I've lost any type of connectivity out to the cloud, those jobs aren't going to get processed. They're not going to go out, right? But if I have something inside of the network there that works as a relay, like Exchange, it pulls those messages in. It will be successful from the device, and then that will just queue them up. So if the external connectivity is off, they'll sit there. When it comes back on, Exchange is going to talk to it and it's going to relay it back out, and all that information will then end up like in the inboxes and so forth. So two sides of that story there.
Thank you, Jesus. And I think that is all of them. We can hang out for another couple seconds if anybody has any additional questions. But while waiting for that, again, hope to see everybody tomorrow. Jesus and I will be talking about the other side of the cloud with Microsoft, which is the Azure conversation, where we'll be talking about our Azure Blueprint workshop, and really what that entails is getting cloud right the first time. So whether you're in the cloud today, whether you're looking at the cloud in the future, or whether you have on-premises solutions that you want to be able to deploy in a hybrid cloud capacity, we're going to talk about all the different components that are needed to get the cloud right the first time. Because as we always say at eGroup, you wouldn't build a data center by powering up the first VM as the first step. There's some things that you want to do. You probably shouldn't do that to the cloud either, right? What are those things? Understanding that you can start the cloud by powering up the first VM. It probably would get compromised, but we'll walk through some of those different things. Everything ranging from governance to a deep dive with security with Jesus, to network architectures for hybrid computing, all the way into many other things around cost management and how to properly design the cloud to be successful. And then we'll also talk about some very point solutions for things like data protection, disaster recovery, further into VDI, and how we can make some of those early adoptions or easier adoptions in the cloud so that you can get your cloud built right the first time, but also take some steps in there. And then, as always, as we said at the beginning of this workshop, our goal is to meet you where you're at. So really understanding what you're doing there. So probably something for everybody, whether you're pretty mature in the cloud and spending millions of dollars as a cloud first organization, or your organization has zero cloud today. There should be something in it for everybody. So with that, thanks again. I know it's a large commitment of time. We'll let everybody go, stop the recording, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. That's what we're here for. Thank you.